The Brutally Speaking podcast is proudly sponsored by Starving Artist Brewing. Starving Artist Brewing may be a small speck on Michigan's beer map, but they say big things come in small packages. A brewery who really puts their money where their mouth is, supporting underground artists far and wide. Making delicious beers with the simple belief that you should judge beer, not people. Brutally Speaking podcast is proudly sponsored by Rockabilia.com. With over 500,000 officially licensed items in their online store, you're guaranteed to find something you need. Use our code BRUTALLY and get 10% off your total purchase order. Now on to the show.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing. This rings true because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up. It's really hard. And you have to do it over a sustained period of time. So if you don't love it, and if you're not having fun doing it, you're gonna give up.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Brutally Speaking podcast. I am your host, John. This episode's guest is Trustkill's owner, founder, Josh Grabelle. I'm not entirely sure. I actually have a friend who tattoos. His name is Josh Grabelle. It's been this fun thing where when I've been telling people who I'm talking to and that I was going to have Josh on the show, everyone's been like, oh shit, you're having Grabelle on the show? And I was like, no, the guy from Trustkill. And a little bit of apologies. You could probably hear it in my voice. I've been fighting off a cold the last handful of days. And you know what? I'm not going to let that stop me. I'm going to keep persevering and getting through and give you some great quality content. This was a really fucking great chat. Josh is someone I've long been wanting to have on the show for a multitude of reasons. As someone who is inquisitive about different eras and times and parts of music and the music industry and the music business and just eras of music, you know, there are stories to be told. There are missing pieces to a degree to me, because I feel like if you are around my age, you know, almost 40 years old at this point, it becomes this thing where there are stories that may not have been told because podcasts didn't really exist. A lot of times speaking about the behind the scenes things of the music industry, it kind of was gatekept, for lack of a better term. And honestly, I don't know that people really cared as much to know so much about what happened to their favorite bands, their favorite labels, to the people that work and do all these things and make basically the scene continue and thrive. And for me, the more I learned about, Trustkill, Trustkill was one of those labels. And as you'll hear me say in the chat with Josh, it was one of those labels that where it didn't fucking matter what band was on the label. The label of the label carried so much weight. And in this day and age where, physical media isn't as, I think, strongly cared about by the consumers, it's interesting to remember a time where it's like, if you saw Roadrunner, like the Roadrunner label, if you saw Trustkill, if you saw Ferret, like that carried such a weight in the scene that you would just pick up whatever because you knew it had to be good. And to kind of think back to that era of music, that era of me being a fan of hardcore music and what was becoming metalcore, to thinking about just how bands and brands were so big. And they still are to this day, but I think, it's interesting to kind of think about, like, are you a Victory guy? Are you a Trustkill guy? Are you a Epitaph Records person? Are you a Roadrunner person? Ferret? Like, these things were kind of ingrained in your identity of who you were. I mean, I can remember having several Ferret Records hoodies. The one with the little snub-nosed gun was classic. I think I had 3 different iterations of that. The camo, this is also kind of dating it, but the one that had the gold foil on it when foiling everything was a hot trend. And I mean, the same thing can be said about, Roadrunner and Trustkill and all these things is, it was sort of this thing that you owned these things and you felt a sense of pride when you owned these albums and you owned these shirts and hoodies and you went out and you found your people. And the other part about this chat that was interesting when kind of setting it up and when I had been emailing Josh back and forth was, I was interested in kind of learning more about who he was. I know you can Google him and you can find some interviews with him, but sometimes I feel like where I want to take things isn't necessarily the route everyone else wants to take things. And I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. It's an interesting thing to me. And if nothing else, a lot of this is self-indulgent because it's just things I want to know. But I feel like when I get comments and emails from people saying like, oh, it was really cool to find out X, Y, or Z because I've always wondered too, that's why I'm interested in doing this. And that's why I love putting out these shows and kind of making it something, maybe it's a little narrow-minded in the scope of that, like, these are things I care about, but it is becoming a thing where I think a lot of people want to know these things. And I know a lot of young and upcoming bands listen to this show as well and listen to, like Doc Coyle's podcast and Josta's podcast and, a lot of music-based podcasts for information. You want to learn from the best and people who have been around for a long time, and you want to know how they did the things they did. And this was one of the few instances where I've been able to kind of actually talk about what I've done. And it was so interesting listening to Josh kind of be like, I started off doing zines and I was doing this, and then I started booking shows, and then I started doing Hellfest, and then I had Trustkill, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of the journey I've gone through in this space as well, where started off being in a band, didn't really enjoy that for a multitude of reasons, and then started booking shows, and then took that as far as I wanted to go, and then started writing about shows, and now I'm doing this. And it's one of those where this has been one of the few instances where I've also been able to talk about what I've learned being kind of more a behind the scenes person in the music industry, but also having it correlate to what I've learned in my professional career as, really a journeyman in so many different things, from working in screen printing and working, almost having 10 years, or maybe a little over 10 years at this point, of customer service and food retail management. And it's one of those things where sometimes you don't think a lot of things are similar or have a similar path, but it is really interesting, especially when talking to Josh, talking about how, people that I was friends with working, it was fine. But then when I became a manager and I had to start kind of cracking down on some of the bullshit that was going on, because it's what's expected of me in my position to ensure that we are running the best that we can, be the most profitable, and just all these metrics and all these things that are at hand, you become the bad guy all of a sudden. It's like, I didn't change. I just have to care more about my job. And unfortunately, if you're not upholding your end of the bargain, or, to make a real loose example, I remember a lot of the people when I worked at Sam's Club, and a lot of people on the front end would get upset with me that I'd start cracking down on them because they're not hitting certain metrics, or, they're not doing and ensuring some of our policies. But it's like, when you just let out an $8,000 TV because you gave the hand scanner to someone and they scanned a barcode for a TV that only cost $400, yeah, I'm going to kind of get down on you because you just fucked up our profits for that. That was huge. Like, you just fucked up real majorly, all because you were too trusting of a customer, didn't follow our policies and procedures that are in place to ensure these things don't happen. It affects our bottom line, and it affects, our bonuses that we get, and it affects all these things. And it allows us and puts us in certain situations where it's like, well, now I have to be an asshole and I have to be tougher on you because these are things that we can't have happen to ensure a successful business, especially if it's, a projected week where we're already down in sales. That really did not help. So it's one of those things where, you can start kind of correlating and finding the through line of, this is probably what it was like owning a label for Josh, where it's like, yeah, I love music and we're having fun and yeah, I love your band. But then it starts becoming this thing where it's like, yeah, man, I'm sorry, I can't give you that money that you want or that you think that you're owed because, well, I have to recoup these costs of X, Y, or Z, and it becomes this business. And, they always say that, friends and business and money don't mix. And I think by and large that is absolutely true. But I really appreciated Josh for going down the many rabbit holes we discussed of who he is, his upbringing. And I think there's just a lot of cool information about Josh and Trustkill that is important to the lineage, basically, of not only the music industry, but of one of the most predominant labels that really meant something to me. And I think a lot of fucking people. And so I'm really, really, really excited to bring you this chat with Josh. It's a long one. Strap in. and I'll see you all on the other side of it.
Just audio.
It video and audio, but I can make it just audio if you'd like.
No, video's cool.
it actually, I'll get to that in just a second because it's interesting in this day and age how things correlate between audio and video. But no, it's funny. Like I ran into a friend now a friend that's from Philly, and he noticed my Wawa tattoo, and I didn't know that's where he was from. But my wife had to endure like an hour's worth of just Philly East Coast centric talk between him and I, and she was like, "You guys lost me at Ilio's Pizza," and I was like, "Man, that was a fucking staple of my childhood." Like having it in school, like getting the giant box of it when you would go to like grocery stores or like Costco or Sam's Club, and I was like, I miss it. I'm sure it's garbage if I were to get it now, but like there's just something so nostalgic and like back home vibes to me, and especially being out here in the Midwest. It's kind of weird because the only thing really that I feel like still to this day that is uniquely Midwest is pop instead of soda and ICP. That was like the first two things I remember moving here being like, I don't know what these things are, and having to acclimate to the region basically. But I think forever I will always identify as an East Coaster, even though I've lived in the Midwest far longer than I ever was out east.
Nice.
I mean, you being from Jersey originally, I mean, I feel like, you probably get that like in your travels and doing everything that it's like, doesn't matter where you call home, where you were from will probably always be ingrained in who you are and what you identify as home.
Of course. Yeah. I remember the first time I heard someone use the word pop for soda. I was up at school in Syracuse, and in Syracuse, they all say soda, right? But in Buffalo, which is only 2 hours away, they all say pop. So it was like a big difference. I'm like, oh, that's weird. Everyone says pop from that city, but everyone says soda in this city. Very strange. But yeah, that was the first time I heard it.
Well, I was talking to someone recently about how I feel like the East Coast is just so uniquely unto itself versus really anywhere else I've gone and traveled to in the U.S., where I was like, you can be in Delaware and like Delaware or like Delco has an accent. Philly's kind of got its own thing. Philly has a few different accents. Jersey's kind of got its own little thing. Boston, Mass, like they got their different dialects. And I was like, really the only other spot that kind of has that regionality to the dialect is kind of the South, but it's just crank the South up, the southernness to it. And that's really the only difference. Whereas I haven't really noticed that in such it is a wide sprawling area of the East Coast, but it's just so interesting to see how many different like slangs and terms and all that kind of stuff come from such a very closely populated area. And it's funny. I know I've told this on the podcast a couple of times. I ran into a gentleman at the airport from Delco, and I leaned over to my wife. I go, I haven't fucking heard this accent in probably a good 22 years. That dude's from Delco, and I fucking know it. And then she was like, what's Delco? And I tried explaining, and he was talking to somebody else. He goes, we're kind of around this. Well, it's kind of like Delco. It's kind of, if you know what that area is. And I just leaned over and was like, I fucking told you. I was like, there's just some dialects you just know when you hear it. And it's so funny that I don't hear them often, but when I still hear people, I'm like, oh, I know you're from somewhere out east, and get really excited to kind of reminisce about some of those things back home.
Nice.
But I was going to say something interesting that I've learned, and maybe you have as well, kind of traversing through the digital age that we're in. It's funny that I'll put these out, the video versions and audio versions separately. And it'll be funny to see what lands in the video version when it didn't land on the audio side. Like it'll be like, it just did okay. But then on like the YouTube version, it's got, thousands upon thousands of views, hundreds of comments and so forth. And I'm like, why are you all finding it here, but no one could find it as it existed in an audio format?
Yeah, I think people just choose their formats, and they don't necessarily want to, they want to enjoy their media in their own way. And, I've noticed it's tough to like, like you build an Instagram following, but they don't necessarily want to click on a YouTube link or a Spotify link. But, it's like, yeah, it's like we used to think that marketing in social media world was like, well, let's just put a link here and we'll get them to go here and we'll get them to do this. And, a lot of those like action sequences are, having less and less impact, I think, overall. Like someone could watch the Joe Rogan show or whatever on YouTube and not even realize that, his full clips are on Spotify or whatever, whoever it might be. It's like you're just enjoying it, like I'm a YouTube guy, so I love YouTube and I love watching everything, But for certain shows or podcasts or albums, or I'm gonna listen and watch things in different ways,
Well, I feel like it's been kind of interesting, in setting up this chat with you and kind of even in the beginning phases of trying to set this up later last year. It was kind of interesting to go back and think about what you kind of had to endure as a business person. And correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, you initially went to college to be a lawyer, correct?
Yeah, I am a lawyer. Yeah.
Well, yeah, still, I'm sorry. I guess it kind of sounded like you went and didn't finish.
Yeah, no, I am a lawyer. I just don't practice necessarily for other people.
Right.
I wasn't always, but now I am, my own lawyer. I do all my legal work myself. But, I graduated law school in 2001. And I mean, that was at a time when Trustkill Records was pretty huge. I had a lot of, I had just done Hellfest 2000 and I signed Poison the Well and 18 Visions and Walls of Jericho and all these bands. And I graduated law school and I was ready to clerk for a judge at the Superior Court in Freehold, New Jersey, about 10 or 15 minutes from me. And I called him up and I was like, hey, man, it was probably 2 months before we were supposed to start. I was like, I think I just got to give this hardcore label thing a go. I had started the label when I was in college in Syracuse. And ran it for a couple of years, and then I took 2 years off and I went on tour with a bunch of my bands and I did graphic design, and then I went back to school and did law school for 3 years. And I was, that whole time, the first 4, 8, 9 years, my record label wasn't supposed to be my job or my career. It was just something I was doing for fun because I loved hardcore music and I just wanted to be as involved as I possibly could in every aspect. I was putting on shows and festivals and signing bands, and I was in my own band and I did a zine and I interned for a distribution company. I mean, I literally did everything I could possibly do. And that whole time I was able to give it like my full focus. And 2001 is when I pulled that trigger and I was like, fuck it. I got to see if I can do this for real and see if maybe it'll pay my rent soon. And it did ultimately.
There's a few interesting talking points to the evolution of basically Trustkill, and I will say more so your personal journey into the music industry. But I kind of want to preface it by telling this story real quick. So my wife and I were on a flight and she was watching a TED Talk, and then she just kind of bumps me and goes, you should watch this. It reminds me of you. And it was this woman talking about when you grow up, or when we grow up, because I think based on timeline, I feel like you're about 4 or 5 years older than me. I'm going to be 39 this year. And was a thing where the lady says, when we grew up, you were always asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? Singularly. It was never kind of that the world was open to you and you can choose your own adventure and go down whatever path you wanted to find happiness in a career. It was always, you had to kind of pick one thing and just do it and go down that line. But the lady ends up talking about how there are people who become multi-potentialites, and it's okay to basically go down one path, take it as far as you want to go, and go, I'm kind of done with that, and then go down some other path. And in your story of talking about, like, I was going to school for law and I started a label and I worked for a zine and all these kind of things, it sort of reminds me of how I've kind of stumbled into working in this side of the industry myself. Like, went from being in a band, didn't really enjoy that for a multitude of reasons, ended up putting on shows, learned and took that as far as I wanted to, and then kind of got burned out from that, started writing about shows and writing about bands and interviews, to then doing this, where I find this, I feel like, was more of my calling. I just kind of had to find it through failed attempts at other things that I was passionate about, but music has always been the thing. So what's interesting to me is, I feel like where, and this is the question for you, when you started kind of getting into music and all that stuff, because we lived in a world where the internet didn't exist, where you couldn't just ask someone randomly or Google, how do I start a label? How do I start a zine? How do I do all these things? So talk about the process of the figuring out of how to do all those things, and what was it like for you along each step of the way to what you ultimately ended up becoming Trustkill?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think about this all the time, because I'll be doing something and I'll be like, wait, how the fuck did I do this in the 90s?
Yeah.
How? Well, I shock myself sometimes. I was like, I went to Europe on tour for a month with Despair, Scott Vogel from, Terror's one of his first bands. We went to Europe for a month. None of us had cell phones. There was no internet. There was nothing.
MapQuest probably wasn't even a thing.
No, I mean, not even close. I mean, I did a tour in Europe before the Euro, right? So,
oh, shit. All right.
So we're in a van. Luckily we had a driver driving us around, but we're playing a show in Germany one day, and then the next day we're in Austria or Italy, and we got to change the money, but we don't know what things cost, and there's nowhere to check, right? There's no internet. There's no, so yeah, I mean, just all these crazy things. But I guess when it comes down to really the actual first thing that I did was the Land of Greed compilation. That was Trustkill #1, which was a 14 bands covering the Embrace album on Discord, which was Ian Mackay's band in between Minor Threat and Fugazi.
Okay.
So that all came about because my roommate at the time at Syracuse was my buddy Joel Jordan, and his twin brother Jason Jordan was running a label at the time, a hardcore label called Watermark Records, which I loved. He'd only put out a handful of records, but every one of them was fantastic sounding, looked awesome. Everything about Watermark was just cool to me at that point. And I would sit there, sitting next to Joel as he's, designing the new Conviction 7-inch or whatever it was. So I really got oh, this is how you make a record, right? So Joel and Jason were a big help right off the bat. And then, I didn't really know anything about pressing plants or where to make things, so after we did the first record, it was a Watermark Trustkill split release. We did it together, the three of us. And then I kind of went on and did I did a Despair record, and I did some more things. And I had no idea what I was doing, but I hustled and I networked, and the singer for Rorschach, Charles Maggio, was running a label called Gern Blanston. It was, back in the 90s, New Jersey hardcore style. And we were talking at a show one day at my buddy John's house, John Hiltz. And I was like, I got this record, but I don't know where to make it. And he was like, oh, well, I run my records through this pressing plan, and you should talk to this guy and I'll connect you. And here's their phone number. And so he was monumentally helpful back then. And yeah, I mean, it was just about cold calling a pressing plant and saying, how do I deliver this record to you? And how did we even, it's funny, I think back, like delivering artwork to a pressing plant to manufacture a CD or a record. How did I even do that? Like, I remember submitting them on like a zip disk, right? But like things like, how did I even get bands to approve artwork? I think early on, maybe I didn't. Maybe it was just they submitted, some basic assets, and I'm a designer, right? So I designed all those early records myself, and then hope that the band liked it. I don't know. I mean, it's crazy to think about, but.
Well, I think like the thing that's, and sometimes like when I talk to people, and like, I've been doing this show for like 6 years, I've done, talked to so many different people through all walks of the industry, from publicists to band people to text to whatever. And it's always interesting when people are like, how do you know all these people? And it's like, it's just networking. Like it literally is, when I go see shows, like a lot of times people are like, oh, you're going to see the Kill Switch guys. I'm like, yeah, but I'm hanging out with Josh, their tech. Because like, to me, that's fascinating. And I like, without what he does as the production designer and like the tech and all that kind of stuff, like the show doesn't happen. Like, and I don't think people understand what a lot of the behind the scenes people actually do. So it's a lot of times, like when I go to shows, I'm more interested in like, let me see like how the show is, like the sauce. How is a sauce getting made? Like I'll go to like Audio World and like basically front of house and just like, all right, so what are you guys doing? What are you running? How are you doing this? And then like, it's kind of fun to watch everyone's setup. It can be super elaborate or it's really simple. And it's just interesting to see how this world works. And to me, the techs and all the behind the scenes people are actually the ones that'll beget you more people because they're in bands. They know other people. They know and tour with other people, which will get you more people. And it's one of those things that when I think about how connected I am to all these different people I know, it's crazy that it's like it started with this one thing. And then it was just funny to see how everything fell into place. And honestly, it's being a pretty, like not being a dick to people as well. Like every opportunity you have, someone can get you something else. And I don't think people treat each other that way anymore. And I feel like a lot of times when I look back at the Trustkills, the Victory Records, and a lot of these things, it wasn't just a label. It was a scene. It was a movement of people supporting each other and being friends and finding extended quote unquote families through the love of this style of music and feeling like they finally belong when they didn't in their own homes or in their own towns or communities. And to me, to think about how was that achievable? Like the thing I've really been thinking about is, Trustkill kind of was an East Coast thing. It was a Jersey thing. Thinking about all the bands that were coming out from Jersey, from Mass, from New York, and all of that, from even to Victory being here in Chicago and getting a lot of bands and being in a big hub in a big networking community. Like, how integral do you think where you were when you were led to the success of Trustkill?
It's a great question. I think it has a lot to do with it, to be honest. I mean, if I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, or some other Midwest city that had a small hardcore scene, would I act? I'm not sure. I discovered hardcore when I was in 7th grade and went to my first hardcore show summer before or after 8th grade. And then that was it for me. That changed my life. Like that first show I went to, I knew that was all I was going to ever want to do. And I spent the next, the 4 years of high school going to every hardcore show I could. And, anyone's older brother that could drive me to a show or whatever it was. And I always wanted to be the first person at the show. And I was always the first person or the last person to leave because I wanted to hang out and I wanted to meet the bands and I wanted to see how everything worked. And I would, get kicked out of the venue and then you're hanging out in the parking lot and you walk over to the band's van and you're like, hey man, can I interview for my zine or, whatever. So yeah. And then, New Jersey had this thriving hardcore scene that I just kind of tapped into. And a couple years later, I'm putting on hardcore shows in the basement of my parents' house, and I had hundreds of people at every show. And again, that was like early to mid 90s, before the internet, really. And I think back, I'm like, how did I get people to show up? How did I even notify people about these shows? Like, I don't even know. Most of the shows I didn't even make flyers.
Oh, wow, really?
Strictly word of mouth. Yeah, I mean, like the first Hatebreed show in New Jersey was in my basement. No flyer. I never bothered to take a photo, never bothered to take any video. But yeah, so I think, and then I went to college in Syracuse. I did not go there because of their hardcore scene. I went there, I don't really remember why. Why I picked that school over like Rutgers or, whatever else. But I went to Syracuse. I started in the fall of 92. And that was right when the Earth Crisis 7-inch, the Earth Crisis All Out War 7-inch came out. And shit just started exploding up there too. So it was like, I was kind of back and forth between the New Jersey hardcore scene, which was blowing up, and then the Syracuse hardcore scene, which was also blowing up. And then I kind of was back and forth. Those were like my two worlds for quite a while. But I was also driving, anywhere within 10 hours that Earth Crisis would play, or any other band that I loved back then. I was going all over the place. But yeah, to answer your question, geographically, I was in two great spots for, the first 10 years of my breaking into the scene or the business or whatever you want to call it. I mean, could I have done a Hellfest type event in New Jersey? At the beginning, I don't know, but it's like we did it in Syracuse for a couple of years, and then we brought it to New Jersey, and it was a massive success that first year. Well, the first and only year. But yeah, I grew up in a great spot, Jersey Shore. I'm still here. I'm in my parents' house where I had those shows. I live here now, so it's wild to be like, oh yeah, that's, I'll be like doing laundry or playing with my kids in the basement. And, that's right. That's where Earth Crisis and Strife and Snapcase and all these bands played in the 90s. It's pretty wild.
This may sound maybe kind of a hard question to answer, because it's possibly hard to remove yourself now looking back on the question and putting yourself there. But I know sometimes, like, you see something like Return to the Pit on Instagram, or like some of the, Mike D from Killswitch will constantly post old flyers from shows when the band first started, and you're seeing photos from old shows. And it's one of those things that, like, there are some shows and some tours, like, I remember seeing and being like, man, that was a really good fucking show. And then you'll read the comments and people are like, oh man, I bet these shows were packed and blah, blah, blah. And you're like, I mean, mine really wasn't. Like, I don't know if that's how it was like the rest of these tours, but there's this sense of like, sometimes when you get into a band or a scene, sometimes you're there at sort of the impetus of it, and you don't realize, like, you can feel something's about to happen, but in the moment, it doesn't really feel like it. Like, it doesn't feel like what it became, because you're able to look back and go, oh, these were the foundational parts of this thing happening. But when you're in it, it's just, it's a show I went to. I drove the couple hours to go see my favorite band and hang out with my friends. And it's a Saturday. That's a Saturday of what we used to do. We'd drive an hour and go to another town and go see another show. It didn't feel like it was becoming this monumental thing that it has since become. Did it, adversely though, to you, did it feel like when you're hosting these shows, when you're, putting Hatebreed on the first time you're seeing this band and they're playing New Jersey, does it feel like, oh man, there's something special about this band, like they're going to be huge, or the scene is kind of about to burst and it's going to be this bigger thing? Did it ever feel like that to you?
I don't think so. I mean, I think I just loved hardcore so much, and I loved all these bands, and I never thought about, when Hatebreed in the summer of 95, I didn't think that years later they were going to be, headlining Ozfest or whatever it was.
Right.
It was just, I was buds with Jamie, and he's like, "Yo, I got this new band. Like, Josta 14 had just broken up, and I was putting on shows in my basement. And he's like, "We'd love to play New Jersey." I'm like, "Great, come down and play." And there were maybe 50 or 100 people there for Despair from Buffalo. I had Ignite play that show, and maybe Endeavor from New Jersey. But let's say there were 100 people there. But now Ignite, any Scott Vogel band, Hatebreed. I mean, these are big bands that are touring all over the world. But I also, people glamorize the past, right? You're going to look back at some flyer from 2004 and be like, "Holy fuck, that show was insane." But back then it was just a show with a bunch of bands that were up and coming, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, a great example I can think, I was up at Syracuse and there was a show with God Forbid. I think God Forbid were headlining, and opening was Bleeding Through and Avenged Sevenfold. And there were maybe 10 to 15 people at the show total. And it was, like, that kind of sucked. I mean, a small show of like 50 people, you're like, it's kind of cool. When you get down to like 10 or 15 with 3 touring bands, like, that's brutal. But yeah, so yeah, no, it's tough. I think, like I said, I think we glamorize the past. We make it sound like maybe that was some huge thing, or like, I started hearing the word gatekeeper in the last couple of years. Like, oh, well, it wasn't for the gatekeepers, or, oh, well, you were just the gatekeeper. I'm like, well, I've never heard of that word until the last couple of years. Also, I never thought of myself as a gatekeeper. I was just, involved in the scene and the hardcore, and I was signing bands and putting out records and putting on shows and booking tours and whatever I was doing. And I was picking bands that I liked. And I guess years later, I found out that was gatekeeping. But to me, I was just like, "Oh, I like your band. I want to sign you." And that was it. I didn't think beyond that,
That actually poses a really interesting question, because I know as I kind of transitioned from booking shows with just local bands and kind of dealing with the bands around this area, it kind of then started, again, it's all about connections and who you know, that it'd be like, "Hey, well, I have a friend who works at this venue. Like, you should put on shows at a venue instead of your house, or these random house shows." To then, "Hey, if you ever want to," like, there'd be some talent buyers who'd be like, "We don't want to do this show, but like, let me pass it along to someone else and maybe they'll be into it." So sometimes, like, just through help, like, I got to kind of take that next step and got like some touring bands through. And what was kind of interesting about that is just not knowing necessarily how to do business correctly, but it never stopped me, because like, I was just like, I have a love of music and I believe in this band, and I guess I'm naive enough to think that good music will bring people out. And I definitely have eaten shit on some shows, like, where I'm like, all right, I gotta go to the ATM and go pay for this out of my own pocket now. But it's one of those things where you said, like, I would just be like, "Oh, I like this band, I want to sign you." What does, at the time, because like that's something interesting to me as you said that, what did getting signed mean to you as someone who owned a label versus maybe what the bands thought getting signed meant back then? Because again, like, we didn't have the internet or podcasts really to have people kind of explain the processes of contracts and all these things and how things work out, or sunset clauses or things, or things like that, of that nature. So to me, like, when you say that, I'm just like, what did that look like for you back then?
Yeah, I think it meant something different throughout the years, and as Trustkill grew and different bands were popping and blowing up and different things were happening, I think it meant different things, right? So like in the beginning, it was, it's funny. I put together that, like I was saying, that compilation album was my first release, right? And those 14 bands that I got to be on that comp were like bands that I had met through the hardcore scene, or they played my basement, or they just were some connected through some other band, right? And then I put out a couple 7 inches for a few bands. But really, like the first album I put out that I remember like people giving a shit about was Despair from Buffalo, which was, you know, Scott Vogel from Terror and Buried Alive. And I think years later I found out, like, I know why I liked Despair and why I wanted to sign them and put a record out for them, because they were awesome and Scott was great. But then, like, years later, I found out that Scott wanted to put the record out with me because he really liked my zine, right?
Okay.
So, and the zine came before the label. So he was like, well, yeah, your zine was awesome. And, you know, we see eye to eye, like on a hardcore level. So that's why he's like, I wanted to do that record with you. And I was like, oh, well, that's awesome. I'm like, you know, whatever it took back then. But that, you know, makes a lot of sense for, you know, for a hardcore band. And then, you know, as the years went on, I think, you know, I got a distribution deal, right? And then my record started, you know, to be in stores. And then it was, all right, well, if we sign with Trustkill, then our records will be in stores. That's cool. And then it got even bigger, and it was like, all right, well, if we're going to sign the Trustkill, our records will be in stores. We're probably going to get a good tour, and we might be on the radio, and we're going to have ads in big magazines, and we're going to be on this sampler CD. And, you know, it was like things were just changing and getting bigger as we went along. You know, and then shit, by like the mid 2000s, it was like, all right, well, if we sign with Trustkill, we could have a career and we could tour the world. And, you know, I mean, at that point I was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on every album I was putting out. Like, it was nuts. So yeah, I think it changed, you know, as the years went on.
As someone who has spent a lot of time working in food and retail and done management and stuff like that, and had to like really focus on numbers, you know, labor percentages and overheads and projections and all this kind of stuff, just in that space, what was the process like for you to expand and grow over those years? Because I feel like the initial concept of this is kind of what I want to do, it has to change from being a fun project you're doing to then it's like, this is serious now. There's a shitload of money. I'm basically providing professions for people, and there are a lot of people who count on me for their livelihood at this point. Now, what was that, you know, progression like for you as a business owner?
Yeah, it was tough. I put out my first record in 1994. I didn't hire anyone to do anything until 2001 or 2002, probably 2002.
Wow.
So the first 8 years, you know, I was a one-man show. And really in 2002, I had a 2-bedroom condo in New Jersey, right? So I graduated from law school in Syracuse. I moved back to Jersey Shore, got a 2-bedroom condo with a small little basement, and that's where I was running a label out of, this little basement. And then I really had to I hired my buddy Kyle and my buddy Timmy to do mail order, because the mail order was like, you know, back then there was no merch now. There was no, you know, all these merch companies that didn't exist. It was like, I was selling merch through trustkill.com because my buddy Dave from Syracuse, you know, wrote the code for my web store, my website from scratch. And I ended up hiring him and putting him on salary about a year or two later. And yeah, I brought them on because the web store and the mail order just, you know, packing up hoodies when I need to be like doing other things, right? So I brought them on, and I was, you know, paying them cash. You know, every week I just paid them cash, and then that went on for like a year. And really, it wasn't until I signed my first big distribution deal, which I signed with Red, which was the Sony independent distribution arm. So I did that deal in 2002, and that's when it finally, like, it was always like I had to use this money from this album sale to pay this, and it was just like, just shuffling money around, like trying to make it work and trying to pay my rent and put out the next record. And I was, using different pressing plants, and it's like all these little tricks you got to do to make shit happen. But then I did my deal with Sony, and it was like, all right, now I have money that I can use to invest in my label and my company, and maybe like hire a person or two and put them on the books. And I'm able to place ads in magazines and do a radio campaign. And I can actually, like, not stress that if I have to do a second press of the Poison the Well album, that I'm not going to be able to pay my rent next month. Like, those are real concerns, right? Because, you press a record and you don't see the money from that record for, let's say, 6 months, right? You got to ship it to the distributor, they ship it to stores, money trickles in, and it's not like you're putting a record out and you're just getting some big check. Like, that doesn't happen. So it was like, it could take up to a year or more for money to trickle back in, or if the record even sold, maybe it didn't sell, who knows, you lose money on that one, then you got to make it up with the next one. But yeah, so yeah, it was tough until I got a distribution deal, and that finally freed up some money. But again, I didn't go and like spend money willy nilly. It was like I could have gone out and like got a big office space, but I always ran my label from my basement, right? So Trustkill never once had an office. It was in my basement. I would walk down in my shorts, maybe wearing a shirt, barefoot, and there's 6 people down there, and yeah, it was pretty wild times. So, but yeah, just that organic growth of a company, any business would operate in a similar manner. Like, you just got to do stuff slowly until you have someone that can invest money and write you a check, so that it kind of frees up some cash to move forward and be able to do things. And yeah, thinking back, when I made that decision this was all kind of happening at the same time, right? Like, I decided to bail on my clerkship with the judge in 2001, and then I signed my Sony deal in 2002. So that kind of happened pretty close together, and it was awesome, because I was like, shit, but now I'm not as nervous that I just completely bailed on my legal career.
Right.
My parents weren't real psyched about that, but I think they knew that I was passionate, and hopefully I was going to turn this into something, which I did. But also at that time, like I said before, I had bands like 18 Visions, Walls of Jericho, Poison the Well, these bands that were like blowing up, but also I had them in contract, and they were to deliver future albums, which I then, felt a responsibility to like really give them the best opportunities that they can possibly have, and not do it half-assed, where I'm like, clerking for a judge and I'm not able to get on a phone call, or, whatever it could be. So yeah, that all kind of came around the same time.
There's 2 things to that I want to explore. First of which I think is interesting to me. You've talked about your parents a couple of times throughout this chat already, hosting shows literally in your basement, and even talking about, ending your clerkship and kind of going more full all in on Trustkill as a business entity. I feel like the support of your parents definitely had to have been the foundation of being able to do any of this, because without their support in you and these endeavors, I don't know that maybe you would have been able to do any of these to the level of success that you had. Was that a fair assessment, or I guess kind of
Oh, absolutely.
explain the relationship with your parents through their journey into hardcore as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, my parents always supported me in whatever I wanted to do. When I decided to bail on the clerkship with the judge, my mom and dad were kind of like, well, "Are you sure about that?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure." My mom is also, or she just retired, but she was also a practicing attorney.
Mm.
And in 2001, when I was supposed to have this clerkship with Judge Lair in Freehold, my mom was actually the president of the Bar Association at that time. So it looked kind of weird that the president of the bar, her son, is just skipping out. Um, but yeah, they, you know, it's like I kind of tell young bands this all the time. It's like, man, take advantage of being young and being able to tour and not have responsibilities and not, not own a house or a car and have kids. When all that shit starts happening, it's like then you have responsibilities and it makes things tough. But when you're young, like when I was 19, 20, I was still living at home, which is awesome. Not everyone can say that.
Right.
I had a great relationship with my parents. I would move home for the summers. And then when I graduated college, I moved back home for 2 years before going back to law school. And then, that was it. But yeah, summer after my freshman year of college, I come home and, my parents' house was built in the 60s, right? So by the 90s, the basement of my parents' house was like a piece of shit, right? It was, it would flood all the time, and we didn't really have anything down there because you couldn't leave something down there because it sucked so bad. And my buddy John was putting on shows. John, from the drummer for Born Against, was doing shows at his house. And for whatever reason, there were two bands on tour that he wanted to do a show for, but he couldn't. So he called me and was like, "Hey, weren't you talking about maybe wanting to do shows at your parents' house?" And I was like, "Yeah, I thought about it." And he was like, "All right, well, I got these two bands on tour. They need a show." He's like, "Why don't we just do it in your basement? I'll come and I'll bring the PA. You can give me $50 or whatever for the PA and have a couple bands play." And I was like, "Great." So I did that. And the two bands that were touring were Unbroken and Mean Season from Southern California. And then I got, again, it's like back then, how did I even know who was on tour, who was where? I have no idea. But I somehow found out that this band Still Life, also from California, were on tour. They kind of were like playing like different little subgenres of the hardcore scene. And Unbroken, Mean Season were from like that new age record scene, and then Still Life were from like the Ebullition scene. And then I got my buddies in Iconoclast, who were a local band, to play. So I had this 4-band bill and told people. I just probably just called my friends and whoever else I knew and was like, spread the word, because there were no flyers, nothing. And probably had 100 people show up for the show. And then from there, it was like, all right, well, then I just rolled that into other shows. And my parents were home the whole time. And at that time in the 90s, we had a bathroom in the basement, but it didn't work. So for all these strangers, well, probably that first show was probably just mostly people I knew. But, when I did 30 or 40 shows in the basement, and it was mostly strangers. And when they needed to go to the bathroom, they had to like come upstairs into my parents' house, go through the living room, and then like find the bathroom, right? So they're doing that. And like my dad's sitting there reading the paper, my mom's in the kitchen drinking tea, whatever, and like, Earth Crisis are playing in the basement the whole time. And my parents would come down, they'd watch a band or two, and they'd crack some joke, and then they'd leave. But yeah, they all went off without a hitch. There were no fights. Nothing really broke. I mean, other than, the basement sucked. And I remember, I had a drop ceiling, right? Standard basement drop ceiling. but like half the tiles were missing and torn down, and I had Sensefield play a show there, and the singer for Sensefield was like 6.5 feet tall or something, and he actually couldn't stand up in the basement, so I had to tear down more ceiling panels in order for him to be able to stand and sing. That was kind of a funny story, but yeah, so they supported me all the way through. They were there, you know, but not necessarily financially, right? Like
No.
when I put out my first record, I had a couple $100 saved up just from like high school gigs. My first job was at Jersey Mike's sub shop, and I saved up a couple $100, and that was it. And that's what I used for like my first record. And I just kind of hoped I'd make money back, and then 6 months later I'd put out my next record, and it was just a really slow process there. Yeah.
Actually, a good segue into the other thing I wanted to kind of talk about. You were saying and talking about, at least like with 18 Visions, Walls of Jericho, and Poison the Well, knowing that you had them contractually to do their next record and wanting to invest back into the bands and, doing good by the bands you had and kind of growing this thing. I sometimes don't think a lot of people understand like how hard it is when you are creating something. Like money's got to go here, money's got to go here, money's got to go here, money's got to go here for all these different things. And in the most simplest of terms, like with the podcast, it was like, oh, it's easy, it's free. You just talk into a microphone or whatever, and there you go. And it's like, all right, well, if you want to be successful at it and have it be a good product, okay, you need better equipment. That costs money. You got to host places. That costs money. You got to like everything costs something. And then it's all of a sudden this thing that I thought was free now is there's an investment into it. And you kind of got to prioritize like, all right, like I really want this thing, but I know I need to pay these things first. And I feel like it's an interesting balancing act. And I talk about this quite a bit on the show from a band's perspective, that it's like you started this thing being in a band because of your love of the friends you have, creating the music that you did and playing shows. That's as far as the idea ever was in your mind when you start. But then you have to become an accountant. You got to become a travel agent. You got to know, government policies as far as like euros, all these things, recording budgets. You got to do all these things that you had no idea that you were going to be interested in. And those that are successful are the ones that learn how to learn those facets of your job and your field and your career and be successful at them. And to me, what's interesting is, you were talking about like when you finally got the distribution deal, that it kind of allowed you to really kind of take some of the pressure, I guess, off of you having to pay for things, or like, am I paying rent this month or am I putting out the next pressing of this record?
Yeah.
What were kind of, when you're able to kind of get, I don't want to call it financial freedom, because I definitely don't think that getting it gave you complete, absolute just freedom to do whatever you wanted to. I think it presents itself then with new issues and new problems that you have to figure out and solve. So when you kind of get to this next level where it's like, oh, if I just get here, everything will be smooth sailing. What was that transition like? Because I feel like now, like I said, you got more things that you're having to deal with, because maybe now you have sort of an upstream boss that you have to deal with, and expectations of actual album sales. And subsequently, maybe you're having to have those hard conversations with people on your roster. Like, we need this tour. We need these things to do X, Y, and Z to start setting us up for the next album, the next 2 to 3, 4, 5 years of our careers, not just me as Trustkill, but you as your band. What was it like kind of navigating that for you?
It was tough because the music business in the 2000s, let's just, I think, well, even the 2010s, we'd had a lot of transitional periods, right? So, when Trustkill was like in its heyday, I want to say, right, like mid to late 2000s, CD sales were doing great, right? So I knew I could sign a band that was great, and I could put out a great album, and I could put it in the stores, and people would most likely buy it, and that would help pay for all the costs that I had, put into that project. But then, it was almost like in the 2000s, when shit was popping, I was starting to spend more and more and more money, and there were bigger expectations for the bands, right? So a band would sign the Trustkill, and they'd be like, "Oh, well, you're going to give me, 20 grand for a music video, right?" And I'd be like, "Well, I don't know. Like, that's what I gave this other band. You're not quite there yet, so you're not going to get 20,000 for a video, but like maybe 5 or 10 or whatever it was back then." Um, and yeah, so conversations were definitely had, and I think a lot of bands couldn't figure out, like, wait a second, you know, Josh gave us 40 grand to go fly to London and play Download Fest, but a year later he doesn't want to do that. It's like, well, dude, because the business has changed so much in the last year, right? CD sales have gone down 50% or whatever it was back then. It's just like, if there's no chance of selling that many records, then I can't just subsidize your entire career, right? And I think a lot of bands in the 2000s looked at their labels to subsidize their careers, and I definitely did that. I subsidized a lot of bands' careers, but at a certain point, it was like, all right, well, now we can't, and it didn't just happen overnight. It was a slow process, right? So we started pulling back the reins a little bit. It's like, all right, well, maybe you don't need me to give you a $50,000 check to go play Warped Tour. Maybe you can just go fucking play Warped Tour. So yeah, the money and just gotta make sure that you are, you have to make sure that no band or specific album is going to necessarily be a liability to the company. So, yeah.
I think the interesting thing, and this again, almost everything, my thoughts are kind of multifaceted with like, here's the initial spark of the idea and the question, and then like little side tangents to it. Around the time that you're talking about now, what's interesting to me is, and I know through different podcasts and interviews with band people, like, this is all common knowledge now, so I don't feel like I'm talking out of turn, but buying on to Warped Tours, buying on to Ozfest, like, I don't think at the time a lot of people understood that labels were just fronting 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, $120,000 for a couple bands to go on a tour. And I know the Ozfest numbers I've heard are just astronomical, which is why, as I say, which is why there was a year that a friend of mine was tour managing and teching for a band, and I don't care about saying this because it's been long gone and they have already admitted this too, but the Showdown, the 2 dates I went to, the Showdown just fucked off and didn't play, and I was like, I know you guys bought onto this tour, like, what the fuck? I'd be pissed if I were your label or your management or whatever, and I'm like, I spent thousands of dollars to put you on a fucking bus, even if you're sharing it with somebody, to buy you onto this tour, and you're fucking off 2 dates just because you don't want to play. Like, you want to get tattooed instead or hang out with your friends? Like, what the fuck?
The Showdown, that band?
Yeah.
They're like on Tooth and Nail or Solid State or something, right?
Solid State, I think, yeah. But I remember the date crazy. In Detroit, they were like getting tattooed and they just didn't want to play. I was like, you can do that? And like, so this is coming.
They were, at that point, Ozfest was rotating openers.
So right? The year I went was the year it was free. So I know that was one of the big years where a lot of bands were buying on to be on the tour, because that's how that and endorsements were how the tour was really able to make money, because tickets were free, but you saw a lot of the bigger names that were on the Ozfests, like headlining the second stage or starting to open the main stages, like the As Lay Dying. As Lay Dying was on Warped Tour that year. I think a few other bands of that ilk were on Warped Tour that year, because it was almost like, we're not buying on and we don't want to go and have an Ozfest date be shit because it's free. So we're going to go do something where we know people are going to be. And having attended both that same year, it was really interesting, because it was like Warped Tour was super heavy that year with a lot of more metalcore bands, as that was kind of becoming the thing. And I'm trying to look at my past real quick to see if I can pull up a year. 2000 was like 2007 was the Ozfest I went to, which I think was like the last year. But Lamb of God was basically direct support for Ozzy that year. Static X was like underneath them. So it's like, you want to talk about different changing of the guard moments, kind of. It's like Static X wasn't really popular at that point, and Lamb of God had just put out Sacrament. So it was kind of like nu metal's gone, Lamb of God and bands of that, space are starting to take over and become, viable headliners or co-direct supports for a lot of these legendary bands, like Ozzy and so forth. But it was just wild, even like back then, like I said, to just kind of see that and just kind of see bands not taking the opportunities or the investments in themselves into their careers seriously. Yeah. And I'm sure that same thing existed well before that. And it's just one of those where I feel like, unfortunately, as someone who has become the boss of somebody, where it's like, I'll give you some rope and give you some leeway, but don't fuck me. And as soon as you start fucking me and you start fucking with my money, now I got to come down on you and be your boss and be the bad guy. And I've always wondered, because obviously it's no secret that a lot of people that had been on Trustkill didn't take and have nice things to say about you toward the end of Trustkill's run. And I wondered if it was a lot of that, where it was the climate of the music industry had changed. CD sales weren't what they used to be. It was costing more and more to get, end caps and so forth in a Best Buy that was also seeing a diminished returns in physical media, and we're going to more downloads and streaming and all that kind of stuff. So instead of being willing to change with you and change and grow to whatever the new landscape was going to be, if that was sort of the beginning of you having to be financially responsible for your own business and your own career, and kind of go, hey guys, I can't give you this anymore. Like, you're not, it's the ROI just isn't there anymore. And instead of being understanding and going, okay, well, obviously you took us on when, you gave us our opportunity. We want to stay with you. There's a sense of loyalty, whatever. If it was kind of a bit of a, I don't know. And this is kind of where I've been trying to figure out the question, but to ask it kind of nicely, but it's like, it's been kind of painted that you became the asshole. Everything was your fault. You were a shitty dude. And I've always felt that there's probably the other side to it that is probably more rooted in truth than feelings. And so I guess that's kind of where, like, I would like to know, like, what do you think ultimately kind of led to, I guess, the quote unquote downfall of Trustkill?
I mean, the downfall was pretty cut and dry. It was just CD sales fell off a cliff, and we went from, so I was with Sony from 2002 to 2007.
Okay.
And then in 2007, I switched from Sony to Universal, right?
Okay.
But when we made that switch,
Can I ask you one quick question before I completely forget and we don't stay on that part of the topic?
Yeah.
What, out of curiosity, what happens, because I would assume Sony then is your upstream, as far as like if a band gets popular, whatever, they would get upstream to Sony.
Not necessarily. I didn't necessarily have a deal like that.
Okay.
For certain bands or projects, that could happen.
Okay.
So like Bullet for My Valentine, great example. I put out, the Hand of Blood EP, then the Poison album, then the live at Brixton Poison DVD, and then they went to Jive proper, which was, Sony label.
Mm-hmm.
And that all worked because the band was selling a lot of records. And then we tried that. We did 18 Visions. They went to Epic. That wasn't really an upstream though, because I had signed 18 Visions on my own, right? So I had them signed for X number of albums, and then when the whole Epic thing came around, it was like, we just kind of made a deal that was great for everybody, right? For the band, for me, for Sony, for everybody. So it all worked out. And back then, I had put out, 4 or 5. Biggest concern was like, well, we don't want to sign to Epic without you being involved. So like, they signed to Epic and they had their A&R guy, but like I was still like the day-to-day, guy doing all the marketing, right? So
Okay.
like when the self-titled album came out in 2007, right?
Yeah.
I did all the marketing for that album, and I let Epic handle like radio promo and like shit that they were good at. But like between the band and management and me, we were like, yeah, let me handle everything else. So you
The
guys
only
don't
re-
fuck this up. They still
the
kind
only
of
reason
fucked it up, but whatever.
I was gonna say the only reason I really asked was because I was wondering if it became this issue later on with like rights, kind of deferring back to like if an album was put out and it was technically under when you were signed and under Sony, that technically it would be like, well, these records belong to Sony, not you. And then when you went to Universal, same thing. So it kind of creates this conflict of if you're trying to do anniversary records and so forth, someone else has the rights, or you got to go through a lot more red tape to
Well,
do
yeah,
those things.
there's no guarantee that anyone has any rights to any album forever, right?
Right.
So it depends on the contract and the band and and what happens, right? So if we're talking about 18 Visions specifically, like the Obsession album that I put out through Trustkill was then, I guess I guess we could use the word upstream, but yeah, upstream to Epic, and so like now Sony is still in control of those last two 18 Visions albums.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, so just going back to the conversation, we went from Sony to Universal, and we knew at the time, like, all right, well, in order for this to work, we're going to have to hit, these like certain sales thresholds each year, right? So like my business manager was like, all right, here's the future, right? Here's the next 3 or 4 years of what to expect, right? We got a new, I have all these, Hopes Fall and It Dies Today and Memphis Mayfire and the Saw 6 soundtrack. And I was, doing all these great records. But the problem was at the end of the 2000s, we're getting to 2008, 9, 10, CD sales started just totally dropping. And it was like, there was no guarantee if a band's last album sold 50,000 copies, you would hope that their new one would sell 50 or maybe more. But really it was, well, the last one sold 50. I mean, you remember like reading all about this, and every website, it was like, oh, Shadows Falls last album did, 30 first week, and this new one did 2,000 first week. And it was like, all right, well, clearly someone's not getting paid back for that album, like whoever it was. But it was just across the board. It was every album was underperforming. And, that got me to like the end of 2009. And I just realized, I'm like, wait a second, I can't put out more records through this company because they just like turned the faucet off, right? They're like, all right, well, if all these records underperformed, you're unrecouped, we can't pay you. And I'm like, all right, well, then I can't pay my bands and I can't pay myself. And so I had to just like move on and start clean, start fresh, and like basically just gave Universal the whole catalog. Which of course, what the fuck? That was my watch just randomly answering me.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah. So yeah. Yeah, I mean that thing that happened to Trustkill happened to a lot of labels, and like, when 2010 rolled around, their CD sales fell off a cliff. They were down 90% or whatever from a couple years before that. Downloads were like just barely there. I mean, people were downloading records off iTunes, but we're not talking about big numbers.
No.
And then streaming didn't exist at that point, right? So the streaming revenue started coming in around 2015-ish, like the middle of that last decade, right? Where streaming finally was like a real thing. Like, oh, let's not focus on downloads or CD sales. Let's focus on streaming because there could be like some actual revenue there, but yeah. So then, of course, Universal took the catalog to recoup all the money that they spent on signing Trustkill and taking Trustkill away from Sony to Universal. But then all the CDs that we had shipped in the 2000s, right? So, Walls of Jericho or It Dies Today are on Ozfest. We would spend $50,000 to $100,000 to push CDs in Sam Goody and Tower and Walmart and Kmart and wherever else. All those places were selling CDs in the mid to late 2000s, or the whole decade, really. And as all those retailers started basically getting rid of their music sections, right? Like, remember, Best Buy used to sell music, and then they didn't, and Hot Topic used to sell music, and then they didn't. So what happened to those hundreds of thousands of CDs was they were all shipped back to the distributor, who had to then give those retailers credit for those CDs. But the money that we would spend, the marketing dollars, the retail co-op is what it's called, we would spend, let's say, $5 extra per CD to put the Bleeding Through album on the Powerwall at Best Buy, right? So we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent to push out all these CDs to retail, which all then ultimately came back in the 2010s to Universal. So it's this company that I walked away from because the money was just upside down, just got even worse in the 2010s once hundreds and hundreds of thousands of CDs came back. And those have all since been destroyed, and warehouses have closed down, and they've liquidated everything. But that was a really hard time, and it kind of amazes me that there's labels like Epitaph or Metal Blade, or these labels with huge catalogs that survived that whole transition to digital and streaming, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, they had to really work at it to make that happen, I imagine. But Trustkill, Ferret, Eulogy, Victory. I mean, all Rise. Rise didn't go away, but all these labels just kind of, it was tough. And bands never really I can't blame a band for not understanding the business. They weren't supposed to understand the business. I wanted my bands to write music and tour, and that's what they needed to do. Some bands had managers that were smart and were able to explain things well, but some didn't, and it's tough. But
Today's Beer Minute is brought to you by Starving Artist Brewery, who share a simple belief: you should judge beer and not people. Today's beer is from Oliphant Brewing out of Somerset, Wisconsin, and it's their super squishy sour ale. Coming in at 5%, this sour really delivers with its tart-forward blackberry and raspberry flavors, all while dancing on your tongue with the coconut back end, really giving it a bit of a pastry taste. Overall, this was a surprisingly well-balanced sour that has me looking forward to trying more from this brewery. Thanks to Starving Artist Brewing, who reminds you to support your starving artists, and please, always drink responsibly. And now, back to the show. I was going to say, I think the interesting thing about this point in the music business, as far as the shift of trends, there were a lot of interesting things happening at this point that I always kind of knew there was something about it. I just didn't quite understand the metrics of it. But you guys, Victory, were really good at, putting out what else I would often call them companion pieces, but I think they're actually holdover pieces. We'll just say 18 Visions. They put out this record, it's blowing up. While they're working on the next one, here's a live DVD. So we have something to hold you over and keep the name on people's lips of doing something like that. One of the most ingenious things I learned about, and obviously now you can't do this anymore, which again talks about the shifting target of the music industry. It's once you kind of think you got it figured out, you got to come up with a whole new business plan. But it's when you would put out, Victory was really good at this of, here's the CD, maybe 2 months later, it's like, here's one with, a live CD in it or a little DVD with the making of the record or whatever. And they'd get you to rebuy it 2, 3, 4 times over because it has something new in it. And I subsequently ended up learning that for every one of those that had the extra disc, that's 2 sales in one album. And it was a way that you could kind of fudge your numbers a little bit to kind of make something seem like it sold more than maybe technically it did, or keep it on the charts longer than maybe its initial shelf life would have allotted. The other one, and you just talked about it, I think it was Jost on his podcast a long time ago, is like, fools used to ship out platinum and would get back gold because you would send out and you're like, oh man, we shipped out over 1 million copies, so like you'd get these plaques, but by the end of the album cycle it'd be like, yeah, but then we had to buy back, or we got back all of 200 300,000 of these things. So it's like it wasn't what it seemed.
They all came back. Came back.
That era was just really interesting because it was interesting to see how it sort of was, to me, the impetus of what vinyl collecting has kind of become, where it's like you keep putting out these different editions, different colorways, maybe one's hand numbered, it comes with these things, and it appeals to the collector in people.
Yeah.
But I also feel like I'm just being old at this point. There's stuff I have now that, like, through that era of buying music when like Hot Topic and FYE and Best Buy and all these places were just essentially doing whatever to sell it, I got some really cool shit that's worth so much fucking money now because I bought low and sold high, or I still have a lot of the stuff. But it's interesting that it just is interesting to remember that era of being a music consumer and just how everything was changing, and no one really seemed to know what was coming. And that the one overall constant, I feel like, is that when streaming started to become more of a thing, and you didn't have to buy a full album on iTunes anymore, or you didn't have to buy the full record at Best Buy, and you weren't spending, the $20 for an album, and it was more manageable, like $9-10 if you got it first week, to push those first week sales. Then I think the fans were starting to realize that bands were more often than not putting out a couple of good songs, putting those out first, and then the rest of the record would be kind of eh. And so instead of, I think, of there being buyer's remorse, I feel like it kind of put more of the impetus back on everyone else to put out a better product from start to finish. And I don't know if that was more of a thing, but it seems to have coincided with the selling singles and going back to the business model of more of like the 50s and 60s, where it's like, we're going to put out a single, you can buy a single, you can buy all of these things. It's not really about a full album experience anymore. And I feel like that's sort of what the industry has gone to overall, is, well, what is the single doing?
Yeah, I would say, for sure that's where the industry has gone, because first Apple and now Spotify has pushed the industry in that way, right?
Yeah.
So, these artists like Drake and Bieber and, whoever that have, 40 million monthly listeners on Spotify, is because they're constantly putting out singles and working, and doing collabs with some other artists, and they're like pushing their Spotify numbers. But, in the hardcore and metal world, right? Hardcore metal fans, they still want the experience. They still want to hold an album. They still, they want to be involved and support their favorite bands in that way. So I think like it's tough because we're in that spot now where yeah, most income now is derived from Spotify. Like that's the one streaming service that has the most paying subscribers and the biggest impact, and like Apple and Amazon and all that shit's cool. But really the focus now is Spotify, and it's kind of at odds, I think, with hardcore and metal, which maybe is kind of cool in a way, right? Because hardcore and metal have kind of always been the redheaded stepchild of music or whatever. And now it's like, we're kind of doing something different. And, I don't know if you want to call it the resurgence of vinyl, because, in hardcore, at least, vinyl never went away.
No.
But it kind of, had its ups and downs. And now we're in a spot where, vinyl is a big thing, but we're also talking about like much smaller numbers.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas like in the 2000s, I could put a record out on vinyl and put out a couple thousand of one record. And now it's like you do small numbers, but they're more expensive, but also the music fan understands that now. Like it's crazy to me, like in the 90s, I was putting out records and selling a 12-inch vinyl for $8, right? Like that's what I would sell it for. And now you can't make a 12-inch record for $8. Like it costs you more than $8 just to make one record. So
well, I mean,
you have to sell them for like, they're selling on web stores for, $20-$25, and that's now normal. And that's like, if you love the band, you're going to buy the record because it looks cool and sounds cool and it's got all the cool shit, and you bundle it with a t-shirt and whatever else. But yeah, I mean, I've always said, like, I put out great music, and whatever medium the fan enjoys that music through, like, I'm a fan, like whatever it takes. If you love Bandcamp and you're a Bandcamp guy, then I'm going to, do everything I can to make that Bandcamp experience cool. And if like I talk to kids at shows and I'll be like, well, where'd you listen to that record? And they were like, oh, I just listened on YouTube. It's like, all right, well, shit, I got to make sure, if that's the medium that you like, then like that album has got to be there on YouTube, and it's got to sound great, and it's got to look good. It's got to, so I don't know where I was going with that, but.
No, I mean, I think it's interesting because you were just talking about like an album being, you could get it for $8 and sell it. Like, I think one of the better examples of that for me, and a lot of people are just like, I didn't even know this existed, but just right place, right time of being a fan of the bands and the era and getting something really cheap was like the Cat of Choir Forever Scorn double LP that It Dies Today put out.
Oh yeah.
A lot of people, when they go through my collection, are just like, I didn't even know this is a thing. And even still today, like looking at It Dies Today's, socials and so forth, people are like, re-released like Forever Scorn, put out the Cave Choir on vinyl. And I'm like, it already was. It already existed. And I think there was a couple of different variants, but it's like, it already existed. And it's like, it's not cheap to put out that stuff anymore. And that's initially why I had asked for clarification when you had changed, your distribution partner from Sony to Universal, if that has been part of the issue of some of these bands, or the want and the desire for some of these re-releases and reissues, and
so
why we're seeing some bands just kind of going the full-on re-recorded, like 18 Visions re-recording Vanity, basically, to, I think kind of be the workaround of like, well, we can't give you what was, but we can re-record it, and now we can give it to you.
Yeah, so every album is a different conversation, right? So if we're talking about 18 Visions specifically, the band actually controls all their early albums except for Obsession and Self-Titled.
Right.
So they re-recorded Vanity not because they couldn't release old Vanity, but because they just wanted to, right? And they have the means to be able to do it. And Keith is a graphic designer, and they can record and design, and it's like they can make that happen. But for the 95% of the Trustkill catalog has been sitting in the hands of Universal since I left it in 2010. So that causes a lot of issues. For example, the fact that in the late 2000s, almost every record I put out was released on a different label overseas, right?
Oh, okay.
So I was doing that. I did that big Roadrunner deal, right? So all the bigger Trustkill releases were released on Roadrunner in Europe in the mid to late 2000s, and then we went through SPV, and we went through JVC in Japan, and we went through Shock and Stomp in Australia, and just all, like, every territory, like, because that's what we did, and we got pressure from management from all these bands. Every manager was like, well, we got to have radio and promo in Germany because we got to play this fest, and so it's got to be on a different label. And so, like, I did a 1,000 license deals in the 2000s with all these records, right? So then what happens? All those companies have gone bankrupt, out of business. Records have dropped off services, and also so much time has passed. It's been 12 years that all those records were delivered in ways that don't work with today's streaming services, right? So no lyrics, low res album art. All the metadata is fucked up. There's no writer credits. There's no, all these things that we have now. We didn't do back then, right? I was submitting album covers at 150 pixels by 150 pixels, and so those were a lot of the issues, right? Which the first 5 years, let's say 2010 to 2015, no one at Universal gave a shit about Trustkill or any record I put out. No one gave a fuck. These were just like, little line items on a spreadsheet of a billion records, right? So no one cared. And then, also the fact that every band's books looked terrible, right? So in 2010, when I, did the last round of royalty statements, every big band on the label that you can think of, like, so if you've heard of a Trustkill band, there were hundreds of thousands of dollars unrecouped, right? For, Ozfest buy-ons and $50,000 music videos and just all that shit. So like no band was going to see royalties for quite a while. So, and then all those CDs came back, right? All had to get credited to every band's account. So it made every band's account 10 times worse. So it was a nightmare of, debt and just it was just crazy. So at a certain point, I went back to Universal in like 2018 with this idea to, I was like, hey, none of these bands are ever going to see royalties. They're so fucking unrecouped, which makes it difficult to move forward with certain things, right? If a band knows, like, it's like, the revenue from Spotify is great and all, but it's like it trickles in. I mean, we're talking about 1/10 of a penny per stream, and whatever it is. So I was like, listen, these bands are never going to see money. They're so unrecouped, but that money was spent so long ago. Let's just wipe all the debt. Let's figure out a way to move forward with these albums. Like, these albums mean something to me, obviously, and to those bands, but also to other people. Like, a lot of these bands are they can tour on these albums. And so, very long story short, I thought I would have a deal done by like 2020 to take back control of the catalog and flow through royalties to bands and be able to fix all the worldwide streaming issues and all the albums that were missing. Because, like, not a day went by where someone didn't tweet me or DM me or email me and be like, why isn't the First Blood album on Spotify, and why isn't Walls of Jericho on this, and how come, it's just like, there's so many issues and so many problems with this catalog. Like, you have no idea. Songs spelled wrong on Spotify, and like, just so many things. And that was a very hard conversation to have with a publicly traded major label. They're like, okay, so who are you, first of all? And why are we going to you want us to take millions of dollars of debt off our books and just start paying all these bands? And I'm like, yeah, that's my plan. Like, that's what I want to do. So that took 4 years to get done. To finally, like, get everyone on the same page, figure out how this was going to work, and make a deal that made sense for me. And June of 2022, just this past summer, I finally finished the deal and was able to call every single band on Trustkill and say, hey, remember how you were never going to see money from this album and you owed hundreds of thousands of dollars? Well, now you don't owe anything. We wiped every band's books to zero, and we're going to give you 50% royalties going forward, which of course no band was ever actually due, because every band, it depended on the contract, but most bands were getting 20% royalties, 22, 24, maybe 28% or 30, like on the high end if they hit a certain sales threshold, or if it was their fourth album, let's say. So my pitch to Universal was like, fuck it, every band, this is catalog. Every band's album, we're going to bump all their royalties to 50%. And, going forward, these bands are going to get everything at 50%. So that was like monumental. And every band was so psyched. And that, of course, that's how we were able to put out like the Bleeding Through This Is Love, This Is Murderous on vinyl, and the Caitiff Choir Dies Today. And we just did the Memphis Mayfire Sleepwalking album. And for 2023, I have shit tons of things planned. But of course, with vinyl, you don't want to like go out too early. You got to wait. So I have a ton of shit at pressing plants, and bands want to, I have four filing cabinets full of masters and reels, live, just so much shit to go through. So bands want to, do remixes and, get the master audio for this, and let's do that. And so there's a lot of talk. There's going to be a Trustkill festival next summer that I'm working on. So I haven't told anybody about that, but that's going to happen. And yeah, just a lot of cool shit has happened in the last 6 months or whatever it's been since July, where I was able to like take the reins. And so if you're following the socials, you've noticed that like all these catalog albums have been like, reissued to the world on every service. It's like these albums were submitted to Apple and Spotify, but like, they weren't on obviously Bandcamp. I put the whole catalog on Bandcamp. That now there's Tidal and there's, all these different things.
Right.
So all these albums now feel new, but they're catalog albums. And then of course, I'm going to be putting out new albums through Trustkill this year and into the future. And so that's a whole nother thing, but yeah.
I was going to say it's been really interesting because for me, having done this show for, like I said, the last couple of years and kind of befriending some of the people that were on your label, I mean, even having Brandon on somewhat recently in the last couple of months, he was kind of talking about, I think it was Declaration. He was like, we turned it in, the label wasn't really too stoked on it and this, that, or the other. And it was just kind of like, I still feel like the narrative is Trustkill. Like if you're, my age, maybe a little bit older, that Trustkill, like there's just labels where it was, like I said earlier, it wasn't just a label. It was like a way of life almost. Like as long as it had that Trustkill sticker on the back of it, I'd buy it. Or if it had Roadrunner, or if it had, whatever, like there was that fandom that existed back then where it was almost like it didn't matter who or what band it was. The stamp that mattered the most was who was putting it out. It almost like had earned the trust, no pun intended, earned the trust of like, we know it's going to be good. And I know, I don't, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, that's how I grew up. The labels that I worshipped as a kid, Revelation, Ebullition, New Age, whoever it was, that's who I was trying to emulate. Like I wanted to make sure, and kind of like a Revelation, there were hardcore adjacent bands I was signing that were from their own kind of scene. It was connected, but it was different, right? And I was always, hoping that if someone bought a Bleeding Through record because they saw the Trustkill logo, that they would then buy this other band with this logo that maybe sounds a bit different, but it's still connected in a certain way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely as the consumer and the prime demographic of consumer at that point, like, it was you guys, Ferret, Epitaph to a degree for some bands for me, but like really it was Trustkill, Victory, and Ferret that were like my go-tos, and Roadrunner. And also oddly even producers, like, you had certain producers that your bands constantly worked with that I was like, oh, I know this is going to sound great. So it was an interesting era of music. And I mean, even, expounding upon it one more wrinkle and one more step, with Hellfest, it's like, I never got to go to one, but like, I can still remember the Hellfest DVDs and making a name for Doug Spangenberg. I mean, to the point where I had reached out to him to come on the podcast when I first started it, because I was like, those Hellfest DVDs were everything. I can still remember, Dillinger like blowing the fire, or what was it? The infamous Norma Jean vocalist that wasn't that great, that everyone still loves talking about, or like, thinking about Lamb of God being a new band and seeing, Mark and Willie playing like BC Rich guitars, which, I mean, that's an era that you just wouldn't even think of anymore because they're so synonymous with the instruments that they play. And just thinking about what a moment in time that captured as well, and how Hellfests were as important to the scene as the Ozfests became to them, or the Warped Tours had become for the punk rock movement. And it's great to hear that there's going to be a Trustkill Fest next year. I mean, I'm already like, as soon as you said that, my mind's like, well, shit, who could be on it? Like, and what bands are coming back to play it? Like, I essentially feel like, almost to a degree, and I don't know if it's working with you specifically in a different capacity, where like, Furnace Fest, like It Dies Today's playing, like, and you're having some of your legacy bands playing the festival, to where I'm wondering if you had a hand in it, because maybe I just did this, I didn't go, but I had a friend pick me up the Blind Side Silence record that was finally released on vinyl, which they picked it up for me, and I still haven't gotten it yet because I haven't seen that person, but like, now they've re-released it to where you could have just bought it. And I was like, no, I want my Furnace Fest exclusive. And I can't wait to get it. But I'm thinking in my head, like, when I saw It Dies Today was announced, I was like, oh shit, like, I wonder if they're putting out, some exclusive vinyl for that, and that you have a hand in it. And, I've seen you pop up on all of my socials. Like, if someone's commenting on something positive, either about Trustkill, about a band, about Hellfest, whatever, I see you commenting. And it's almost this thing where like, some people might be like, oh man, this motherfucker's everywhere. I'm almost looking at it going like, this is almost like a grassroots approach to being like, let's build this thing back up to probably how it started, where it was just word of mouth and making people give a shit. And it's funny that as I see all of this, I'm like, oh, it goes back to the flyering days that bands used to do. And it was been really interesting to hear that a lot of the stuff you were doing, like, I didn't flyer, just word of mouth, and people came. And I'm like, fucking flyer, like that was everyone's bread and butter back in the day. And kind of really, I think, showcase that like, you were willing to put in the work and the sacrifice, maybe for nothing, but it meant that much to you that you would put, boots to pavement and go grassroots this thing, because it meant that much to you. And I don't feel like, sadly, I don't really feel like that exists in this industry, really. Like I, of course, through being on this side of things, I see publicists, someone like Amy, that worked at Roadrunner for a while and, now has her own PR firm. Like, she gives a fuck about all of her bands and everything that she does. The team she has working for her, they give a fuck about what they do. There are people in the industry, and, Brian Slagle gives a shit about Metal Blade. He lives and breathes, his label, and always has. That there are people who will forever be who they are because of the music that they love and support. They just happen to be in this wild space where they own a label and own a part of some people's history and their childhood and their youth. And, we are kind of, I guess, forever indebted to your debt that you incurred to do this. But it's, as like I said, being almost 40 and seeing a lot of these bands coming back, and in some instances bands that, like, I'm going to the Botch reunion in about a month from now. That was a band I got into, and they broke up right when I got into them. So I never got to see them because, and this is another thing that I feel like kids don't understand nowadays, is you used to not be able to go do whatever the fuck you wanted. You had to kind of earn it by just existing. Like, there were so many fucking great tours I missed because they were sponsored by Budweiser or Jaeger or some company that made it to where you had to be 21 and up to go. And it wasn't because I wasn't there and didn't want to spend my money. I just literally wasn't allowed to go to these shows. And to miss out on a lot of these opportunities of bands that mean something to me, to see these bands coming back, to see Trustkill coming back in whatever iteration it will be moving forward, it's kind of really cool because it's been coinciding with me literally not becoming a jaded, burnt out dude from doing this podcast, where I'd listen to music and go, all right, what's the hook? What am I finding that no one else will stumble across? So when I talk to someone, it's something new. It's something different that you're going to be able to hear from that person. And I really got burned out and hated music for a while. I stopped listening to music. And it hasn't been until really the last year or so where I've been like, I'm really a fan of fucking music. And I really enjoy like putting on a record, even if it's an old record that I know front to back, just getting the new artwork, getting to see it in a bigger capacity than just the CD, or not having the CDs anymore, because how can you play them anymore? But just having this thing where I'm like, I'm a fan of music and this era of music that I grew up in that made me feel connected to a wide array of people. And getting to do this has been crazy. Like to get to talk to some of these people, you know, even like Chris from Poison the Well, getting to talk to him, and all we really talked about was just learning who we are through taking drugs and and kind of letting go of our ego and stuff like that was just crazy. But it's been fun to kind of almost traverse back in time and kind of get to learn more about the people that made these moments for me. And I mean, for that, you know, I'll thank you for taking the time, and being so willing and honest to tell your story on this show. Cause I don't know if it means as much to others as it does to me, but this is the kind of shit I love talking about. And in really peeling back and talking about the business of things, I think is so monumental, because now we have a wealth of information that the kids that are coming up now can learn, so they don't get fucked, and they can figure out, like, are we a band that should sign to a label now? Maybe it's better for us to just kind of strike it out on our own for a little bit more, build up our own name, our own brand, and come back in a year or two or whatever and be more valuable and understand what we want out of a label, versus just getting signed is the end all be all goal because we're signed and that's what you want. Like, I feel like information is key, and it's so invaluable. And to have someone like yourself come on a show and not hold back about, you know, the ins and outs of how you got where you were, and maybe some downfalls and missteps, but kind of being able to right the wrongs down the road, I think is huge. So I appreciate it.
Nice. All right, thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
I do have a fun last question before I have you plug whatever you would like to plug. So as you were kind of saying, you know, didn't have the ability to have different, you know, merch distributions, or, you know, like a Merch Now or something like that. One of the podcast sponsors I have is Rockabilia, and, you know, they've been around for a very long time. So one of the things that I've enjoyed doing lately is asking people what's their favorite piece of merch that they have. Obviously, as someone like yourself that's been around the scene for so long, had the bands on your label, getting to be a graphic designer and having a hand in doing some of that stuff, what is a favorite piece of merch, or a few pieces of merch that you enjoy?
Good question. I would say, so it's no secret that I love Earth Crisis. One of my favorite bands of all time, probably the most important hardcore band of all time, I'm going to say. It was 1993 or 94. I was up in Syracuse, and Earth Crisis were playing Middlesex County College in New Jersey, which I was, of course, familiar with all those shows, because when I was in New Jersey, I was going to the Middlesex College shows. And I drove with the band and other friends from Syracuse to New Jersey for this Earth Crisis show. And on the way out of the town, we stopped at a t-shirt place. This is a little shitty spot in Syracuse where Earth Crisis guys printed their very first t-shirts, like their very first Earth Crisis shirts that they've ever made. And they made, I don't know, I want to say 4 dozen black long sleeve shirts that said All Out War, which is for the first 7-inch, which had just come out. Mm-hmm. And I remember I put the box of shirts in the trunk of my car, but I opened it up and I just grabbed the first one off the top of the box. of the top of the pile in the box, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm grabbing this, and I took one, and they sold all those long sleeves at that one show. So the very first Earth Crisis shirt ever made was all sold at that Middlesex show, and I grabbed the very first one, and I still have it, and I still wear it.
Oh, so conveniently, it was actually your size.
That was, well, yeah, whatever, it was a medium or large. Well, but they're probably all large back then. I don't think we made other sizes. So I just grabbed one. It was a large. I'm a medium to large guy. So yeah, that, just having that. I remember like in the late '90s, like some European guy was like offering me hundreds of dollars for it, and I almost sold it, and I'm glad I didn't. Now here we are 20 years later, and I imagine if I tried to sell it, I could probably sell it for a lot, but I would never consider it. So yeah, that's a cool story about that shirt. What else? Another cool piece of merch. Probably just like my old like demo collection, right? Like I have a ton of cool vinyl and CDs and all that shit, but like my old like hardcore demo, I kept every demo from every band that I liked from when I was in 8th grade, to now. So, the first Bane demo I have, and the first Most Precious Blood demo, and the first Buried Alive demo, and just all that shit. And of course, I posted a photo of them on my Instagram and had people offer me thousands of dollars for my collection, and I was like, I'm good. I enjoy looking at it in my my entertainment room. I have got my whole setup, right, my turntable, my records, and my cassettes, and even though of course I choose, when I listen to music, I choose to use Spotify because I love Spotify, and I love having my playlists, and I try not to let the algorithms direct my listening, but sometimes it does, and sometimes you're like, oh, that is a cool band. I'm glad you made me listen to that. But I go out of my way, and I'm like, I want to listen to this band, and I'm gonna check this out, and even if I have a CD or a record, I'm probably still just gonna use Spotify. And I don't know what else.
I guess an interesting question.
I mean, all the Trustkill. I mean, obviously, all the Trustkill, the test presses I have, and the I have all the original artwork for 18 Visions and Walls of Jericho, and like all that. Like if it existed in real life, I still have it, and I have every master tape, and I have I got 2-inch reels for earlier albums, and that I couldn't even play anywhere, and so yeah, just a lot of cool shit like that. I mean, I could, like much like you were saying with Slagle, right? Like he opened up that little museum thing in Vegas. Like I could definitely do that someday with all the shit that I have that I've never gotten rid of. I have so like you watch the Hellfest DVDs, right? You see all the big Hellfest or the big Trustkill banners. I have all those banners. Everything, like if you know me, like my friends make fun of me because I'm kind of a hoarder, right? But it's served me well being a hoarder because I've saved everything. So, and that also really helped with revitalizing Trustkill, right? Like the last 6 months. And actually, even before the deal got done, I spent 6 months easily when I was like, oh, this is probably going to happen. When I felt confident enough that this deal was going to happen and I was going to be able to revitalize, I started going back, and I'm like, all right, well, shit, I got to find this master. And what about, another cool thing was being able to put out all the unreleased music that I had in this catalog, right? So going back to the 2000s and licensing all these albums overseas, when we did that, they always had bonus tracks, right? Like that was just how it was done back then. You want to go play the big festival in Japan, you have to have a local release, and you got to have 2 bonus tracks on that album, or else they're just not going to put it out, which it made sense at the time. And So all of those bonus tracks didn't exist in the streaming world because they were put out on physical medium overseas in Europe, Japan, Australia, wherever it was. South Africa, I had Brazil. I was doing all kinds of shit all over the world. So it was awesome to be able to reissue all these albums with all the original bonus material and then a ton of unreleased material, like unreleased songs from all these bands. And so if you go to Spotify, there's on the Trustkill Spotify page, which you can link through from any social medium or trustkill.com, whatever. There's a Spotify playlist called Trustkill Plus, which is like over 50 tracks of all these unreleased songs and B-sides and remixes and live songs and a lot of cool shit that people potentially missed out on if you didn't live in one of these other territories. Right. Like the big to-do was like that song Saskatchewan off the last Hopesfall album I put out, right? So that was on their Japanese release and I think the European release. And so now that's on the album. When you go on to Apple or Spotify, Amazon, that song is now at the end of the album, which is, what I did with, the It Dies Today albums and Bleeding Through and, all this stuff. So, yeah, now it's like people were like, oh, I love It Dies Today. I had no idea that they did a Depeche Mode cover, right? Like that.
And that was a James one too.
You may have loved the band, but you didn't know that back in the day. And it's like, well, now you know, and here it is.
Yeah, I've actually still been, because Jason is from here and was in a band that actually made me want to move here before he ended up kind of doing the Stilly route and then moving to Buffalo to join IDT. But I remember when he played the demos because he came back home for like Christmas or something and was like, yeah, check out our demos or the pre-pro or whatever it was. And I remember just being like, God damn. But he's like, yeah, we're doing like a whole DVD thing with the release, and I never could find a copy. And I was like, it's got to exist online somewhere. And I still can't find the DVD that came out with Lividity, like the first run of it. So I'm hoping eventually that will somehow make its way onto the thing. But that was actually something I was going to bring up before too, is it's got to be interesting.
Oh, wait, let me interrupt you real quick before I forget. Just a week or two ago, if you check the Trustkill socials, I just put up all the original 2000 and from pressings from the 90s and 2000s, all the CD pressings are for sale at coldcutsmerch.com. So you can find that link wherever, coldcutsmerch.com/Trustkill. And that Lividity CD with the DVD is definitely for sale for like $10.
Sweet.
So go grab one. As well as 18 Visions Obsession with the DVD. We did It Dies Today, Caitiff with the DVD, I think. We did Bleeding Through the Truth with a DVD. There's a lot of CDs there, all with the bonus shit, all shrink wrapped with like the Trustkill trading cards and inserts and all kinds of cool shit. So again, that's something that I've just been holding on to for 15 years. In the hopes that this would all happen and I could get rid of these.
Well, I was gonna say, is it funny to you to know that because I've always joked that as I get older, the whole point of getting older and becoming an adult, quote unquote, is just to buy all the shit from your youth that you couldn't get back then, that your parents didn't get you. Speaking of Most Precious Blood, I remember going to Hot Topic and they had Our Lady of Annihilation in the little listening booth. And I remember I was like, the album artwork is really interesting. And I'd listened to the first track and I was like, sold, picked that up in the Frail Words Collapse by As Lay Dying. But weird things that you can just remember where you were when you heard a song and it can take you right back to that same place. And as I've gotten older, all I've been doing is just finally getting Our Lady of Annihilation on vinyl, getting Merciless finally on vinyl, getting some of these things that I'm these records mean so much to me, and to have them in a different capacity that I'll be able to listen to them more now has been really cool. And now my thing, a friend of mine has been getting into the vintage t-shirt selling thing once, touring and not being able to tour went away for him, and seeing a lot of his Most Precious Blood t-shirts. And I'm like, fuck, Like as soon as I'm like, I'm gonna buy that, and then all of a sudden it's like sold, and I'm like, shit. All right, well, now I got to try to scour the internet for some more of this stuff. But it's probably got to be wild to know that at one point you couldn't give this shit away, and now it's become like very sought after again. And it's probably got to be a bit of a mind fuck.
That's the problem. I remember a defining moment. Again, going back to the end of the 2000s with the death of the CD, it was like big festival in New Jersey, Bamboozle, massive festival. It was either Bamboozle or Skate and Surf. I forget which one. But
Bamboozle,
I'm not
my name.
Yeah. Actually, I think it was Bamboozle. Actually, I think It Dies Today with Jason were playing. And it was in New Jersey, North Jersey. There were, 100, I don't know how many people were there. Let's say 100,000. It was massive. It was, My Chemical Romance were exploding, and they played, and Muse, and huge. So we had a booth set up, of course, for selling stuff. And I was trying to, so I had a lot of when I was saying when the CDs come back from the stores, right, retail, they go back to the distributor, and the distributor has to figure out what to do with them. When they realize that their warehouses are too full, then they want to ship them back to the label, or they just destroy them, right? So at that point, I was telling them, all right, well, all right, destroy 10,000 of that Most Precious Blood CD, but send me 2 boxes, right? So I'd have a couple hundred just to have, but sure, destroy the rest. And then those numbers got much, much bigger as the years went on. As more CDs came back, it was like, oh, okay, destroy those 300,000 CDs. And but so we're standing there, me and my friends at Bamboozle, and we're trying to give away free CDs to people, and nobody wanted them. Like they would look at it, and they just either put it back on our table, or I'd see them walk 50 feet, and then they'd throw it in the garbage or on the ground. And these were big bands, bands that people liked, but at that time, no one gave a shit about the CD, and they just didn't want them. And that's when I was like, oh shit, CDs are not. This is not something where we're going to be selling a lot of CDs in the future. This is going to be a niche thing, like vinyl has been up until now, right?
Yeah.
Vinyl was niche, but we were, if I sold 50,000 CDs of one record, I'm going to sell 1,000 on vinyl, right?
Yeah.
And now those numbers are even smaller, of course, for vinyl. But yeah, that was a defining moment when kids started throwing them on the ground, or they wouldn't even take them. I was like, oh shit, this is crazy.
Yeah, that was the crazy thing. I went through and consolidated the CDs I actually wanted to keep, which at this point I think just really consisted of my entire It Dies Today, or not It Dies Today, I'm sorry, Every Time I Die, all of the CDs, because most of those had DVDs with them, all of my hymn CDs, and I think Kill Switch, and probably about it. Maybe some of my rap stuff, but my old co-host, he was like, "Are you just gonna throw them away?" And I was like, "Yeah," because you can't even sell these to anyone. I could go through the painstaking process of putting them on eBay, putting them on everywhere, and hoping someone will hit me up and do it. But it's by the time you start adding in bubble mailers and all that stuff, it's that's just not even worth it.
Pain in the ass. I kept I'm a hoarder, of course. Well-known hoarder. I saved every CD from my personal collection that I gave a shit about, right? There was a time where I was getting, 100 CDs a week in the mail from bands trying to get signed and, whatever. So a lot of those went in the garbage over the years, but the CDs that I liked from bands that I liked that meant something to me, I saved all of them, and it was about maybe 500 or 600 CDs. If you check out my Instagram, I posted a photo of them maybe a year or two ago, and you can zoom in and you can see the spines of every single CD that's in my collection is all there. It's cool.
Yeah, I think the only thing that's been
and also now I'm doing this thing where I'm realizing going through the Trustkill catalog so painstakingly and figuring out, all right, I've realized that there's so many things that I was missing from my own personal collection, right? Like, um, like for example, we did a live terror album, like the CBGB's terror album, which is crazy to think about that we recorded and released a live album for Terror playing. It was their very first show in New York.
Oh wow!
It was just 2004. They hadn't played New York City. No, I'm sorry, New York City. They had never played New York City. Their very first show at CBGB's. We record it and put it out as a live album, and it's like one of my favorite live albums. But I realized I didn't have a copy of it on vinyl or CD. That's just like one of the things that like slips through the cracks. It's like I'm licensing out a lot of things. I'm putting out a lot of records. I realized I forgot to keep a copy of the Terror DVD that we put out that came with the fold-out Terror stencil that you could spray paint. So my new thing is I'm like going on Discogs and I'm like, all right, I forgot to keep a copy of this, and all right, so and a funny story, I forgot. So again, another Terror thing that I forgot to keep. When we put out One with the Underdogs, the first album, the very first pressing of it on CD came, and I'm pretty certain no one has done this since I did it because I was the only one crazy enough to do it. But it came on a CD that was black and opaque and had ridges like a vinyl record. I don't know if you remember that. So the very first pressing, we made a lot because back in 2004 when that came out, CDs were still the big thing. So I think the first pressing was maybe 5,000 copies that came on a vinyl CD, but that played like a CD, but not like vinyl, of course.
Right.
And I realized I didn't have a copy of that. So I went on Discogs, and I wasn't that familiar. I just made an account, and that was one of the first things I went to go buy. And I'm like, all right, and I went and bought it. And of course, I bought it from Mean Pete, the singer for Remembering Never. I didn't realize I was buying it from him because his username was just like whatever the fuck. Yeah. And of course, like he mailed it to me. He's like, Josh, what's up? Holy shit! And like sent me something else, and was all psyched to like reconnect or whatever. And he's like, wait, why are you buying this from me? I was like, dude, I forgot to keep a copy. I'm like, how fucking cool is this thing? And like he happened to have like an extra copy or two. But yeah, it's just shit like that. Like there's just so many things. Like I've barely even gotten into like all the international releases, like the Brazilian version of the Walls of Jericho album, or the Australian version of actually I still need to find a copy. In Australia we did this cool thing for a few of the bands like Throwdown and Terror, Walls of Jericho, maybe Bleeding Through. A lot of the bands that were like bigger and had more than one album, we were packaging them together in Australia. Right? So you'd go to the store in Australia and there'd be, both
a bundle,
like two Throwdown albums together, but with like a cool O card with cool art and, whatever. And they just looked fucking awesome. And I was like, and I forgot to keep certain copies. And also like, companies I would license shit to back then would be like, oh yeah, we'll send you a box of 10. And of course they never would. And then I'd forget about it. And then they'd go out of business or, whatever happened. So it's been a huge process trying to, and I have barely begun the vinyl thing. There's so much vinyl I'm missing, but I'm at a point where I don't even know if I want to even go down that road and try to finish my own collection of the Trustkill catalog, because there's a lot of shit I'm missing on vinyl.
Yeah, my wife for the longest time would always be like, why do you stress about getting like the first, like if a record comes out and there's like the lowest numbered variant or whatever, like she's like, why do you try to get that one? And I go, because it's the least amount. So if I have one, then I have one. And so I remember, I was going to say, I remember when my vehicle took a shit on me and I needed to get a new one. I went through a lot of my records and stuff and was like, all right, I'm going to start selling stuff because I know I have stuff worth a lot of money. And I remember at one point, I had started putting some stuff up on Discogs and on eBay and went to my local record stores and all that kind of stuff. And I had a copy of Throwdown, or she had a copy actually. She put in some of her records because she was like, I don't listen to records. I listen to, Spotify, Apple Music, whatever. And she was like, yeah, just go ahead and throw this Throwdown record in there. And I was like, yeah. And she was like, yeah. And she goes, I got it for like $4. Like there was still the price tag on it. And she was like, she's like, I always hated it because some asshole fucking wrote on it, like his name on it or whatever. And I remember finally looking at it and I was like, that's not some asshole. That's Dave Peters. Dave Peters. It was the only signature on it. And so when I finally put it up for sale, I think I sold it I take it back. It wasn't for my vehicle. That was for a vet bill, like an emergency vet bill we had to come up with for a couple $grand to get a surgery for my dog. And I remember posting, I was like, bittersweet. I'm finally getting rid of this Haymaker record, but someone finally, like, that was the last one to sell that got us to the number I needed to get to have the surgery. And I remember somehow, I think either I tagged Throwdown on Twitter or something, but Dave commented, he was like, wish I could just sign all my shit and like pay for my vet bills or my bills. And I was like, I mean, if I can, you easily could. But I just remember it was just this really interesting exchange of just like, my wife for the longest time just thought whoever owned it before was a dick and just wrote their name on the front of the album to be like, this was mine. And I was like, no, that's fucking Dave Peters. So it's interesting.
Going back to, like if an album comes out and there's 100 of a certain color, you're like, oh shit, I need that color because there's only 100. And like the other variants are more numbers. And that's just kind of like the game that we play, but the game kind of makes sense because it is fucking cooler if you have the one of 100 because there's less. That's just, it's more scarce, so it's just cooler. And, so when Revolver magazine came to me with this idea of we want to do, I'm sure you've seen the Revolver Icon series, right? Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So they came to me with that idea over the summer, which was perfect fucking timing, because I just got control of the Trustkill catalog back, and I was like, yeah, there's like 100 albums I need to put out on vinyl. And they had recently bought their own pressing plant, so they could do whatever they want, and they could do a lot of things that a lot of every other pressing plant can't do. They're like, we want to do this whole thing, and they pitched me this whole idea. And it sounded cool, but really what really hooked me was the one of one variants. And I was like, wait a second. So you're going to press a couple hundred copies of a record, but you're going to do one of ones. And they're like, yeah. And I was like, that is so fucking cool. And I reached out to my buddy, who's like a massive vinyl collector. And I was like, dude, I didn't tell him what this was about, but I was like, what would you pay for a one of one variant of your favorite band? And he was like, there's no limit, and it's my buddy Jeff, who famously has the world's most valuable Revelation Records collection. So I really trust his opinion. And I was like, well, shit, if that was your answer, then, and I already knew my answer, because I was thinking like my favorite band, if there was like a, Gorilla Biscuits or Misfits, one of one variant, and I was the only one in the world that had this color. Like, how fucking cool would that be? So that's when I was like, all right, yeah, let's do this. This is going to be cool. Because people talk about test presses all the time, and test presses are cool, right? You have a test press, I'm sure.
First Korn record, usually 1 of 5 approved, and it's numbered.
That's a test press?
That's a test press.
Yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, test presses are awesome, and they go for a lot of money, but typically there's 5 or 10. Or, who did I just see? I just saw someone trying to sell off a pressing as though they were test presses. Like it was just black. They're just like, they're pretending that it's a test press. I'm like, wait, what? So, if, in theory, no pressing of any record needs more than 5 test presses.
They're
But some
starting to
labels will
become
do
more of a
10,
thing now, or more.
and now it's like well, now there's 20, and it's like, all right, well, maybe 20 isn't so special anymore.
No.
And that's like the hardcore kid in me being like, wait a second, like test presses should be like just a couple. But again, if I could get a one of one variant for a band that I loved, that would be insane. So like I think that's how Revolver is making these Icon series like really cool. And we'll see. Not a single one has shipped yet.
No.
But they're supposed to be shipping in the next few weeks, I'm told, and I'm dying to see what people think and what people are saying, and like, what these one of one variants are going to start looking like and going for, and what the overall vibe is going to.
Yeah, it's interesting because like that Korn test press, a friend of mine that runs Enjoy the Ride and owns it, Enjoy the Ride Records, was re-releasing the first Korn record, and I was like, dude, you gotta test press. And he was like, so we have 10. There were 5 that were not approved, and then 5 that were, like, for the record that finally got approved. I guess there's something wrong with whatever the first 5 were, but they have completely different screen printed jackets. So the non-approved ones are silver, the approved ones were gold, and they're hand numbered. And I remember I was like, within reason, throw me a number and I'll pay it, because like that record is massively huge to me. And the fact that there's only 5, and presumably only the band or anyone associated with the process of making it should have one. I was like, the fact that I could even get one is pretty fucking monumental. And somehow I think I used the wrong bank account. And my wife, as I was getting ready for work, was like, what did you spend blank amount of money on? I was like, huh? What? Nothing. And then I was like, no, it's fine. And then she was like, did you buy that record? And I go, yes. And she goes, why would you spend that much money on that record? And I go, because it's like fucking really cool, and it's a piece of like my musical history and upbringing and so forth. And there's only 5.
I remember I just recently was explaining to someone who's not involved in music or the scene that people will buy the same album over and over and over, and they like couldn't grasp that concept. I'm like, yeah, if you love a band, do you want everything that band does? And if there's something out there that you don't own, like you feel like you need to have that, and that's just how we are. That's just as music fans, that's just how we are. Like, I in my dealings with my label and my bands and records, and I always think back to, well, when I was in 9th grade, how did I think about this? I put myself back in that spot, and I'll be like, well, shit. Yeah, like if there was a, like a leeway, or a, Bad Brains thing that I didn't own, I would need to own it. Like it didn't matter what it was. And of course, some labels or bands kind of exploit that, and they'll just continuously put shit out. But like, if you play it smart and you're not like, exploiting the fan base of a certain band, and you're just doing cool shit, then I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I think that's the hard part right now is, I'm going to say this because I feel like both of these bands do a very good job of catering to their fan base, but I also think maybe it's a little bit too much to the point of they know that like their fans will just buy any fucking thing. Glassjaw is essentially almost more of a brand than it is a band at this point. And I do think that they've done really well with doing the whole, like, we're going to release different merch exclusively at shows, or different colorways or vinyl variants and so forth. You have to come to the show and get it. But I know that was kind of the thing. Like when I got there, I was like, I got to get my record. I got to get this, because I'm only going to be able to get it here on this tour. And they don't do the, well, here's the blowout of like all of the end of tour merch. It's like they just hold on to it, or I guess it sells. The other is Deftones. Like they now are essentially almost a clothing brand too, where it's just like, here's this line, the summer line, the winter line, the whatever. And they do some really cool shit. And like, I remember when they were doing the 20th anniversary of White Pony, like they did a tequila, and I was like, well, I mean, I like spirits, and I mean, I don't know that it has anything to do with White Pony in any way, shape, or form. But as soon as I heard that there was only like 3,000 of them and they only had a small distribution. I was like, all right, well, now I need to get one. And then I started scouring the internet for someone who could buy me some. And coincidentally, I was like, I want 2 bottles because I do want to open one and I want to drink it. And then I was like, and then I want the one I have. And because I have all of the beers too. I have like all of the first iterations of the beers they've done. And just I have 2 to keep as a souvenir because they're cool. And I was lucky enough somehow that the person who bought them for me got one where I have bottle 106 and I have like bottle 20 something. Wow. But I didn't know if I had actually like number 20, I think it's like 24 or something. I had to tag the company and go like, do I have bottle whatever? Or what fucking number is this? Because I had a dash and it didn't look like any of the other numbers. And I hadn't seen one that low to compare it to anything. And the company finally like, responded and they're like, yeah, you got like bottle like in the low 20s. And I was like, holy shit. And it's one of those things that like, it probably doesn't mean anything to anybody, but I was just like, oh my God, I got like 106 and I got a really low number of this thing that's like super rare and limited. And I think they've done a couple more batches with different, bottle labels or whatever. The labels are different. And I'm like, I don't need those because I have the original variant of whatever, but it's sort of a disease. Thankfully, I don't have that one where I'm like, I need every variant of everything. Like I do have friends that when they collect vinyl, like I got the Hot Topic exclusive, the Death Wish exclusive, the FYE exclusive. Like I own 17 different variations of the same record. And I'm like, I have one and I'm pretty all right with that. I might have it on CD, vinyl, and something else, but like, I don't need every literal iteration of the record that exists. Because
for me, like,
it hasn't changed.
Going back to what you were saying before about, Roadrunner would put out an album and then 6 months later they put it out with 4 extra tracks and other shit like that. Like for me, I'm not looking to exploit a band's fan necessarily, right? Like my hope, when I was doing that back in the 2000s with Bleeding Through and Throwdown and It Dies Today and Terror and, my hope was that putting out that new release with the new product was going to get like the distributor and retail and the stores excited so that they would actually take more copies. So in hopes, I'm going to sell a copy to a new fan, not necessarily an existing fan, right? Like that's what I was always trying to do. Like, all right, well, let's try to get new fans. Like this is a great album. Let's try to get a new fan. I don't want the old fan to buy 2. Like that's silly. But like, let's try to get new fans. And like, it's the same kind of thing with vinyl. Now I'm hoping that because the vinyl numbers are so small that if we do a second or third, fourth, fifth pressing of something, that like the newer fan that missed out can now buy this and not have to pay the Discogs or the eBay number. Right.
Well, I think Victory has kind of proven that model to be very successful because a lot of people would get pissed and they're like, oh, Victory's just bleeding all their old roster for all it's worth. And I'm like, I don't really think that it's that, because if that were the case, they wouldn't be selling these records for like $10 or $11 because the profit margin on it can't be that great unless you're making so many and you're getting price point breaks that's, from the retailer or manufacturer. But it just becomes this thing where I go, I think it's a thing where if X band, we'll just say A Day to Remember because it's the easiest band to think of off the top of my head. A Day to Remember is still making music. They're still maybe making new fans now. And instead of price gouging them and being like, well, if you want Homesick or if you want, for those who have heart, you're going to have to pony up $40, $50, $60, $70 for what we have left of the original pressings. They're like, no, we made a new variant. It's $10, $11. Be a fan of the band. And for that, I don't really think that that's being greedy or evil. I actually think it's being a responsible owner to kind of allow people to have access to this thing that you've already probably recouped several times over, that it's like, fuck it. Like just make something cool for the fans and have it be that. Like not everything has to be 100% a business decision to make money and line your pockets.
Yep, totally.
But this has been fun. I gotta go walk my dog and then get ready to go to work. Lastly for you, where can everyone find you or anything you'd like to plug online?
Everything is very easily findable. Trustkill.com. I launched a new website about a year ago that has all kinds of cool shit on it. Links to everywhere. You'll find links to the Cold Cuts merch and Revolver if you want new vinyl pressings or old CDs from the 2000s, or you want new merch, whatever, it's all there. And then, of course, all the socials, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, everything that you could possibly want to know or need to know will be there. So join the email list at trustkill.com. Follow us on all the socials. You can follow me if you want. And that's it. And yeah, man, next year, a lot of new cool shit happening next year. And into the future.
I'm shamelessly going to put myself over here. If you are doing a Trustkill Fest next year, I'm putting my hat into the race there to cover it as media, because that sounds like something I definitely want to do. So
you won't be able to miss it. Let's put it that way.
Awesome. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, and I'm sure we'll be chatting soon.
All right, man. Thanks.
So that was my chat with Josh. Once again, want to thank him for taking the time. Just a great fucking dude. I really had high hopes for this conversation, and I can honestly say, sitting here a day after it happened, that it couldn't have gone better. It couldn't have been more of what I wanted. And a lot of it, honestly, is just Josh willing to go down the tangents with me and kind of, really peel back the layers of what was happening. And I think one of the more interesting talking points, and I kind of really just hit him with it, was just like, at the end of Trustkill, there is a lot of narrative that's out about you and the label, that it was just shit wasn't done right. You were kind of fucking people over, and I guess kind of what was happening from your perspective. And for him to kind of really just talk about, the 2010s and CD sales were just tanking, and it was costing so much money to, get ads in papers and to have end caps and so forth in stores, and just all these avenues that weren't available anymore, and just dealing with the shift in the music industry. Like, it's so fucking fascinating to me, because I remember as a consumer going through this and just kind of being like, well, why is this label not putting out stuff anymore? Why, just all the questions, and to finally get some semblance of answers beyond just, well, fuck that guy and fuck that label and blah, blah, blah. Like, it's kind of nice to kind of start painting a fuller picture of what really was happening back then. And to me, I feel like that's a huge, huge thing that we can take and learn from maybe now and what's going on. And I can't help but think that it's got to be really great for Josh to kind of get the second bite at the apple with Trustkill. With, he could have just left everything where it was and just, not gone back to Universal and Sony and all them and been like, hey, like, let's make this right. Let's get the music back out there. Let's try to take care of the bands and do all these things. And he didn't have to do that, but I think it really showcases who he is as a person and what he's about. And I think really showcases who he's always been. Just someone who's passionate about the scene, the music, and wanting to make a home and give back to this community that he's long loved. And to see Trustkill coming back, it's crazy. It really is hitting my nostalgia, like I had kind of alluded to, with Furnace Fest kind of bringing it back. It Dies Today, and a lot of these older bands from, from the Ferret and the Trustkill days and so forth. It's wild to see, to be able to kind of relive my youth in music and see so many people still give a shit about it. It's fucking great. And honestly, that little tidbit toward the end of Josh kind of talking about a Trustkill Fest. Honestly, I'm recording this intro outro a day after we did the conversation, and I will tell you that my mind is still abuzz with what does that look like. I mean, we get excited about It Dies Today, finally coming back. We're getting excited about, Bleeding Through, kind of coming back and putting out some records and touring around some of these, iconic albums and getting to hear these classic songs from our youth. And, even with the God Forbid reunion shows, Nora playing and coming back, it's like, that might be the last one, but it's like, is it? Could it be? Like, to think about all the bands that were on Trustkill and to have a Trustkill era, like all Trustkill bands festival, man, that just, my mind has been racing with who could be on the festival, who could come back that we haven't seen in a decade at least come back for the festival. And it's really just this incredible thing that could happen. I guess it is going to happen. I just don't know in what capacity. And honestly, as someone who never got to experience the Hellfests in person, thinking about it, like, this could be my one and only opportunity to kind of get that kind of second taste of what Hellfest was. Because I have to imagine it's going to be that's sort of going to be the blueprint for how this festival goes. But man, I'm just very excited to see this thing coming back that meant so much to me and so many people, and to see that it still means something to Josh and that he, won't let it go. I think speaks to volumes about his character and just who he is and how passionate he is about all this. And it was a really incredible chat, and I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I know, like I said, it's a lot of self-serving conversations for me when I have these people on, but I think it's important to have these people tell their stories. All of that said, let's start wrapping up this episode. I know it's rather long. If you would like to keep up with Trustkill, it is simple enough. You can go to Facebook at Trustkill, Instagram and Twitter at Trustkill Records, or just simply go to the relaunched Trustkill.com. Find everything there. As you heard him say toward the end, you can pick up a lot of the CDs that have been long out of print. They still have some. I know I'm probably going to be picking up quite a few vinyl here in the nearish future. Damn you, Josh, you got more of my money. All that said, if you like to keep up with Josh, you can find him at his namesake on Instagram and Twitter. You can simply look in the show notes below, follow him, see some of his prized collection of vintage merch and CDs, tapes, all those kind of things. I have been going back through his Instagram posts and just kind of been loving his, the things that he has and feeling a sense of a little bit of jealousy, if I'm being honest. Some of these things that he has, you're just like, fuck, I wish I had that. It'd be worth so much money. It'd just be cool just to have this like one of one or whatever. And honestly, that is the thing as a collector. We get jealous of other collectors for the things they have. But, I know it comes back tenfold sometimes. Some people will see some of the things I have going through my record collection or some of the posters and things that I have. And people are like, oh man, I wish I had that. And it's fun. It's fun to be a fan, and that's something I know I've been talking a lot about in the last couple episodes of this new year. But I really hope it does come across that I have really refound my love and fandom of this scene of music and of these things, and really wanting to kind of be inspired again to maybe inspire all of you to go back, start buying some of these things, rebuy your youth. I mean, fuck it. What else can you do? It has been a wonderful thing for me to kind of rebuy a lot of the things from my youth and just feel this sense of not only nostalgia, but just this sense of, I don't know, happiness. That's really the only thing I can say. I literally have a smile on my face. I'm looking at some of the records I've recently been buying and re-listening to and re-getting into, and it's been making me happy. And that's all I hope that's something that, this show can provide for some of you, or maybe make you remember, oh man, I forgot how great, that Our Lady of Annihilation record was. I fucking forgot how great it was. I forgot how much I loved, Trustkill or that era of music. And I went back and started listening to a lot of these bands again, and just remembering friends and shows and all these things and the connections that we've made through this music that's remained and been timeless for us. And ultimately, I hope makes you happy. Like I said at the end, that's all I can really hope for. Lastly, if you would like to keep up with me, the show, you can find Brutally Speaking on all the socials at Bruce Speak Pod. Definitely been enjoying kind of getting more people reaching out and kind of talking about some of the newer episodes and what they mean. It's been really great. Not something I'm used to getting, so I'm very much appreciative of everyone that's been reaching out. Continue to do such. You can email me at brutallyspeaking@gmail.com as well. I try to reply to my emails as quickly as possible. You can send me a DM. I'll usually see it, I believe. I'm trying to be better at checking the other folder on Instagram, as I'm learning there is that. And yeah, really, that's it. I want to thank our sponsors once again, rockabilia.com and Starving Artist Brewing. Go check them out, support them. They are great sponsors, great people behind the scenes that work there as well. And for the Brutally Speaking podcast, I am John, and I'll talk to you all next time. Have a good week.